Of all the 7 wonders of the ancient world, only one has never been found. No ruins, no foundations, not a single stone. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Were they real, or just a beautiful legend, whispered across millennia? Tonight, we journey to ancient Mesopotamia, to the land between 2 rivers, where a king built paradise itself, all for love. Close your eyes and let the gardens bloom once more. Of all the 7 wonders of the ancient world, 6 have been found. We know where the Great Pyramid stands, the mountain of stone on the Giza Plateau, 4,500 years old, still the largest structure ever built by human hands. We have walked the ruins of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, where 127 marble columns once rose toward the sky. We have touched the scattered stones of the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the tomb so magnificent that it gave its name to all grand tombs thereafter. We have gazed upon the foundations of the Colossus of Rhodes, that bronze giant who stood astride the harbour mouth for barely 50 years before an earthquake brought him crashing down. We have traced the outlines of the lighthouse of Alexandria, whose fire guided sailors home for 16 centuries. We have read the ancient descriptions of the great statue of Zeus at Olympia, whose gold and ivory splendor made visitors weep with wonder. But one wonder remains lost. One wonder may never have existed at all. Tonight, we journey to ancient Babylon, to a garden that hung in the sky, to a love story written in flowers and stone, to a mystery that has puzzled scholars for 2,000 years. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The Greeks called them a wonder not because they were large, like the pyramid, or tall, like the lighthouse. They called them a wonder because they were impossible. A garden needs water. Water flows downhill. It seeks the lowest point, the easiest path. It does not climb mountains or scale walls. It does not rise into the air of its own accord. And yet the ancient writers tell us that in Babylon, water flowed upward, that trees grew in the sky, that a green mountain rose from the flat brown plain, watered by streams that defied the laws of nature. It was magic. It was engineering. It was love. Or perhaps it was none of these things. Perhaps it was only a story, told and retold until it became legend. There is no test tomorrow. No notes to take. No need to remember anything at all. Simply rest and let the gardens grow around you, like vines climbing toward the Mesopotamian sun. Let us begin in the 6th century before the Common Era, in a land between 2 rivers, where a young king dreamed of building paradise on earth. But first, let us understand the land itself. Let us pause for a moment to remember the other wonders. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands to this day, the only one of the 7 that has survived more or less intact. It was built around 2560 before the Common Era, 2,000 years before Nebuchadnezzar's time, and it will likely stand for 2,000 years more. It was the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4 millennia, a record unbroken until the spires of medieval cathedrals finally surpassed it. The pyramid was built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops. It contains over 2 million blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 80 tons, quarried and transported and lifted into place by tens of thousands of workers over the course of 20 years. Even today, with all our technology, we would struggle to duplicate the feat. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was considered by many to be the most beautiful of the wonders. It was a Greek temple, built on the coast of what is now Turkey, dedicated to the goddess of the hunt. Its 127 columns rose 60 feet into the air, supporting a roof of cedar wood and tiles of marble. Inside stood a statue of the goddess, draped in gold, surrounded by offerings from worshippers who came from across the ancient world. The temple was destroyed and rebuilt several times over its history. An arsonist named Herostratus burned it in 356 before the Common Era, seeking immortality through infamy. It was rebuilt more gloriously than before, only to be destroyed again by Goths in 262 of the Common Era. Today, only a single column remains standing amid the marshes. The statue of Zeus at Olympia was the work of the sculptor Phidias, the same artist who created the great statue of Athena in the Parthenon. It depicted the king of the gods seated on a throne, his body of ivory, his robes of gold, his expression one of divine benevolence. Ancient visitors who saw it said the statue was so magnificent that it seemed alive. The statue stood in the temple at Olympia for nearly 1,000 years, surviving earthquakes and invasions, until it was finally destroyed. We do not know exactly how or when. Some say it was burned when the temple caught fire. Others say it was carried off to Constantinople and destroyed there. All that remains are the descriptions of those who saw it, and coins that show its image. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus was a tomb built for Mausolus, a Persian satrap who ruled the region of Caria in what is now southwestern Turkey. His wife, Artemisia, commissioned the structure after his death, and it was so magnificent that it gave its name to all grand tombs thereafter, mausoleums, we call them, in his honor. The mausoleum was decorated with sculptures by the greatest Greek artists of the age, Scopas, Bryaxis, Timotheus, Leochares. Friezes depicted battles and hunts, gods and mortals, the triumph of civilization over chaos. It stood for 16 centuries before being destroyed by earthquakes and dismantled by crusaders who used its stones to build a castle. The Colossus of Rhodes was a bronze statue of the sun god Helios, erected to celebrate the end of a siege in 280 before the Common Era. It stood perhaps 100 feet tall as the Statue of Liberty, without the pedestal, overlooking the harbour of the island of Rhodes. The Colossus stood for only 56 years before an earthquake brought it down. The Rhodians left the fallen statue where it lay, honouring it as a sacred ruin. Visitors came for centuries to marvel at its enormous limbs sprawled across the ground. Finally, in 654 of the Common Era, Arab invaders sold the bronze for scrap, and the Colossus vanished from history. The lighthouse of Alexandria was perhaps the most practical of the wonders. Built on the island of Pharos in the harbour of Alexandria, it stood over 300 feet tall, its spire visible for miles out to sea. It guided ships safely into port for 1,600 years, through the reigns of Ptolemies and Romans, through earthquakes and invasions, and the slow decline of the ancient world. The lighthouse was finally destroyed by earthquakes in the 14th century. Its ruins sank into the harbour, where they were discovered by underwater archaeologists in the 20th century. Massive blocks of stone still lie on the seabed, testaments to a wonder that lit the darkness for generations. And then there were the Hanging Gardens. Unlike the pyramid, they have not survived. Unlike the temple and the tomb and the statue, no fragments remain to be collected and displayed in museums. Unlike the Colossus and the lighthouse, we have no reliable accounts from people who actually saw them. The Hanging Gardens are unique among the wonders. They are the only one whose existence is doubted, whose location is unknown, whose very reality is a matter of scholarly debate. They are, perhaps, the most wonderful wonder of all, a miracle that may have been only a dream. Before there was Babylon, there was the land. The Greeks called it Mesopotamia, the land between rivers. It is a name that has echoed through history, a name that means cradle and crucible, birthplace and battlefield. For it was here, in this narrow strip of earth between the Tigris and the Euphrates, that human civilization first took root. Imagine standing on the banks of the Euphrates 6,000 years ago. The river moves slowly past you, brown with the silt of distant mountains. The water is warm, almost blood-warm in summer. It smells of mud and growing things, of life and decay. Reeds grow thick along the banks, rustling in the wind. Fish leap in the shallows. Waterfowl cry overhead. To the west, the Syrian desert stretches away toward the setting sun, a vast expanse of sand and rock, hostile to human life. To the east, across the Tigris, the foothills rise toward the Zagros Mountains, their peaks white with snow even in summer. To the south, the rivers flow together and empty into the Persian Gulf, that warm shallow sea that connects this land to the wider world. And here, between desert and mountain, between river and sea, lies the most fertile land on earth. The soil is dark and rich, deposited over countless millennia by the flooding waters. Each year, when the snows melt in the distant mountains, the rivers rise and spread across the plain, leaving behind a layer of fresh earth, thick with nutrients. Crops grow here as they grow nowhere else: wheat and barley, dates and vegetables, in quantities that seem miraculous to travelers from poorer lands. But the fertility of Mesopotamia came with a price. The floods were unpredictable. In some years, the rivers rose gently, depositing their gifts of silt without damage. In other years, they rose in fury, sweeping away villages and drowning livestock, destroying in hours what had taken years to build. The people of Mesopotamia learned to manage the waters. They dug canals to direct the floods. They built levees to hold back the rivers. They created irrigation systems of astonishing complexity, networks of channels and gates and basins that could water fields miles from the river itself. This struggle with water shaped everything about Mesopotamian civilization. It required cooperation on a scale that scattered farmers could never achieve. It required leaders who could organize labor, engineers who could plan systems, scribes who could keep records. It required, in short, the apparatus of the state. And so the first cities arose. Uruk was perhaps the first. By 3500 before the Common Era, it was a metropolis of perhaps 50,000 people, the largest city the world had ever seen. Its temples rose above the plain like mountains. Its walls stretched for miles. Its streets teemed with merchants and craftsmen, priests and soldiers, scribes and slaves. It was in Uruk, the stories say, that writing was invented. The first tablets were simple things, records of grain and livestock, inventories and receipts. But within a few centuries, the scribes of Mesopotamia were recording poetry and history, law and religion, the first literature in human history. After Uruk came other cities, and Eridu, Lagash and Nippur, Kish and Akkad. Each had its temples, its kings, its armies. They traded and quarreled, allied and warred, rose and fell in patterns that would repeat themselves for millennia. The first empire came around 2334 before the Common Era, when Sargon of Akkad united the warring cities under a single rule. Sargon was a figure of legend even in ancient times, a man of mysterious origins who rose from cupbearer to king, who conquered all of Mesopotamia and beyond, who created something the world had never seen before, a state that encompassed multiple peoples, multiple languages, multiple traditions, all under one crown. Sargon's empire lasted barely a century before it collapsed into civil war. But the idea of empire, of a single power ruling over all the land between rivers, never died. It became the dream of every ambitious king, the prize for which armies marched and cities burned. After the Akkadians came the Gutians, mountain barbarians who ruled briefly before being driven out. Then came the third dynasty of which saw a flowering of literature and law before its own collapse. Then the Amorites, Semitic nomads from the western desert, who founded new dynasties across the land. It was the Amorites who built Babylon. Babylon was not always great. The city appears in the historical record around 2300 before the Common Era, a small settlement on the Euphrates, unremarkable among the dozens of other towns that dotted the Mesopotamian plain. It was overshadowed by older, more powerful cities, to the south, Akkad to the north, Kish nearby. For centuries, it was little more than a provincial outpost, ruled by whoever happened to control the region. That changed around 1894 before the Common Era, when an Amorite chieftain named Sumuabum established an independent dynasty in Babylon. His successors expanded the city's territory slowly, generation by generation, until the sixth king of the dynasty, a man named Hammurabi, transformed Babylon into the center of an empire. Hammurabi is remembered today primarily for his law code, that famous collection of judgments carved on a black stone pillar, now in the Louvre in Paris. The laws are harsh by modern standards. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, death for adultery, drowning for fraud. They reflect a world of brutal certainties, where justice was swift and public and final. But Hammurabi was more than a lawgiver. He was a conqueror who united all of southern Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule. He was an administrator who organized his realm with unprecedented efficiency. And he was a builder who transformed Babylon from a regional capital into a city worthy of its ambitions. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became something new, a city that claimed not just political but cosmic significance. The Babylonians believed that their city was the center of the world, the axis around which heaven and earth revolved. They called it Babylim, the gate of the gods. They believed that the gods themselves had chosen this spot, had founded this city, had blessed it above all others. This belief would persist for more than 1,000 years. Through conquest and defeat, destruction and rebuilding, the Babylonians maintained their conviction that their city was special, sacred, eternal. Other empires might rise and fall. Babylon would endure. But endurance is not the same as dominance. After Hammurabi's death, his empire quickly fragmented. Babylon remained an important city, perhaps the most important city in southern Mesopotamia, but it no longer ruled. For the next 1,000 years, it would be conquered and reconquered by a succession of foreign powers. The Kassites, a mysterious people from the eastern mountains, ruled Babylon for over 4 centuries. The Elamites sacked the city and carried off its treasures. The Assyrians from the north gradually extended their control over the region, and it was the Assyrians who would set the stage for Babylon's greatest age, though not in the way they intended. The Assyrians were the most feared people in the ancient world. Their homeland lay in northern Mesopotamia, along the upper Tigris River, in a region of rolling hills and occasional rainfall. Unlike the south, where irrigation was essential for survival, the Assyrian heartland could support agriculture without elaborate canal systems. The people who grew up there were hardy, independent, accustomed to defending themselves against raiders from the mountains. From these origins, the Assyrians built a military machine unlike anything the world had seen. Their army was the first to be organized as a permanent, professional force, not farmers called up for seasonal campaigns, but full-time soldiers trained to fight and kill. They developed new weapons and tactics. Iron swords that could cut through bronze armor, siege engines that could breach the strongest walls, cavalry that could strike fast and retreat before enemies could respond. And they developed a reputation for cruelty that served them as well as any weapon. The Assyrian kings boasted of their atrocities. Their inscriptions describe flaying captives alive, impaling them on stakes, cutting off hands and feet and noses and ears. They piled up severed heads outside conquered cities as warnings to others. They deported entire populations, scattering them across the empire so they could never unite in rebellion. This was terror as policy, violence as propaganda. The Assyrians wanted their enemies to know what awaited them if they resisted. Often, the mere approach of an Assyrian army was enough to make cities surrender without a fight. By the 9th century before the Common Era, Assyria had become the dominant power in the Near East. By the 8th century, it controlled an empire stretching from Egypt to Iran. The great Assyrian kings, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, were masters of the known world, their power seemingly absolute and eternal. Babylon, for most of this period, was an Assyrian vassal. The Assyrians respected Babylon's religious significance. It was, after all, the home of Marduk, a god even the Assyrians honored, but they tolerated no defiance. When Babylon rebelled, as it did repeatedly, the Assyrians responded with devastating force. The worst of these responses came in 689 before the Common Era, under the king Sennacherib. Sennacherib was a hard man even by Assyrian standards. He had crushed rebellions across the empire, sacked cities from Judah to Elam, built a palace at Nineveh that he called the palace without rival. When Babylon rose against him, encouraged by the Elamites and led by a Chaldean chieftain named Mushezib-Marduk, Sennacherib determined to make an example that would never be forgotten. The siege lasted 15 months. When Babylon finally fell, Sennacherib ordered its complete destruction. The walls were torn down. The temples were razed. The great statue of Marduk was carried off to Assyria. The canals that watered the city were diverted to flood the ruins. Sennacherib's own inscriptions describe the destruction with evident satisfaction. The city and its houses, from its foundation to its top, I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire. The wall and the outer wall, temples and gods, temple towers of brick and earth, as many as they were, I razed and dumped them into the Arata Canal. It was devastation on a scale that shocked even the ancient world. Babylon, the gate of the gods, the holy city, reduced to rubble and standing water. But Babylon would rise again. Sennacherib was murdered by his own sons, killed, some said, by the vengeful gods of Babylon. His successor, Esarhaddon, sought to atone for his father's sacrilege. He rebuilt Babylon, restored its temples, returned the statue of Marduk to its shrine. The city that had been destroyed was reborn, and in the chaos that followed the Assyrian decline, Babylon would have its revenge. Empires fall. It is one of the most certain facts of history, and one of the least predictable. One moment, an empire seems invincible, its armies undefeated, its kings unchallenged, its power stretching to every horizon. The next moment, it is gone, its cities burning, its people scattered, its very name becoming a byword for vanished glory. The Assyrian Empire fell in barely 20 years. The causes were many. A series of civil wars weakened the central authority. Rebellions flared across the empire, in Egypt, in Babylon, in the mountain regions to the north. Nomadic peoples pressed in from the steppes. The military machine that had conquered the world began to crack. But the fatal blow came from an alliance between two peoples the Assyrians had long dominated: the Babylonians and the Medes. The Babylonians we have already met. They were a proud people with a long memory, nursing centuries of grievances against their Assyrian overlords. The destruction of their city by Sennacherib had been avenged, but not forgotten. They waited for their chance. The Medes were a different people entirely. They lived in the mountains of what is now western Iran, in valleys green with oak and beech, watered by streams from snow-capped peaks. They were fierce warriors, expert horsemen, proud of their independence. The Assyrians had raided their lands for centuries, extracting tribute and slaves, but had never fully conquered them. Around 626 before the Common Era, both peoples rose against Assyria at the same moment. In Babylon, a man named Nabopolassar seized power. His origins are obscure. He may have been a Chaldean chieftain from the southern marshes, or possibly an Assyrian general who switched sides. What is certain is that he was ambitious, capable, and ruthless. He declared himself king of Babylon and began the war that would destroy Assyria. In Media, a king named Cyaxares unified the various Median tribes into a formidable fighting force. He trained his warriors in new tactics, organized them into disciplined units, and turned his attention to the Assyrian enemy. The two kings made an alliance. They would attack Assyria together, divide its territories between them, and ensure that neither would threaten the other. To seal the bargain, a marriage was arranged. Nabopolassar's son, a young prince named Nebuchadnezzar, would wed a princess of Media. Her name was Amytis. The war against Assyria was swift and devastating. In 614, the allied forces sacked Ursa, the ancient religious capital of the Assyrian Empire. 2 years later, they turned their combined armies against Nineveh itself. Nineveh was the largest city in the world. Its walls stretched for 7 miles. Its population numbered perhaps 100,000 souls. It was the seat of kings who had ruled the known world, the repository of treasures looted from a dozen conquered nations. It fell in 3 months. The siege began in the spring of 612. The Allies surrounded the city, cutting off supplies, bombarding its walls with siege engines. According to the Greek historian Diodorus, the river flooded that year, undermining part of the walls and creating a breach through which the attackers poured. The last Assyrian king, Sin-shar-ishkun, died in the flames of his burning palace. He may have killed himself to avoid capture. The sources are unclear. What is certain is that he was the last. After him, there were no more Assyrian kings. The allies plundered Nineveh with systematic thoroughness. The palaces were stripped of their treasures. The temples were burned. The libraries, those vast collections of clay tablets that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, were scattered and buried in the rubble. The city that had terrorized the world for 300 years became a ruin, inhabited only by wild animals and the ghosts of the past. The prophet Nahum, writing in the Hebrew scriptures, captured the moment with savage satisfaction. "Woe to the bloody city," he wrote. "It is all full of lies and robbery, the crack of a whip and rumble of the wheel, and galloping horses and bounding chariots, horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without end. Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her?" And now, at last, we come to Amytis. We know almost nothing about her. Her name appears in no contemporary record. No image of her survives. She exists only in the writings of Greek historians who lived centuries after her death, who heard the legend of the gardens and sought to explain their origin. But we can imagine her story. We can piece together, from what we know of her time and place, the life of a princess who left her homeland to become a queen in a strange land. Amytis was born in Media, in the mountains that rise along the western edge of the Iranian plateau. Her father was Cyaxares, the king who had united the Median tribes and destroyed Nineveh. Her childhood would have been spent in Ecbatana, the Median capital, a city of cool breezes and mountain views, of palaces built against snow-capped peaks. Media was not like Babylon. Where Babylon was flat, Media was mountainous. Where Babylon was hot, Media was cool. Where Babylon depended on irrigation, Media was blessed with natural rainfall. The landscapes could hardly have been more different. A princess growing up in Media would have known the beauty of the mountains. She would have walked through forests of oak and beech, smelled the scent of wild flowers in alpine meadows. She would have seen snow fall in winter, watched streams swell with meltwater in spring. She would have known the cycle of the seasons in a way that no one from the river plains could understand. She would have learned to ride. The Medes were famous horsemen, and even royal women were expected to master the art. She would have galloped through highland pastures, perhaps hunted deer and wild boar in the oak woods, felt the wind in her hair, and the thunder of hoofs beneath her. She would have learned the ways of her people. The Medes worshipped Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, and his opposite Angramaynu, the spirit of destruction. They believed in a cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and lies. Their priests, the Magi, tended sacred fires and interpreted dreams. And she would have learned her duty. A princess of Media was not free. She was a piece on a political chessboard, to be moved as her father saw fit. Her marriage would serve the kingdom, strengthen alliances, secure the peace. Her own wishes, her own happiness, were secondary considerations. When Amytis was perhaps 15 or 16 years old, her father told her she would marry the crown prince of Babylon. We can imagine her feelings. Excitement, perhaps, at the prospect of becoming a queen. Fear at leaving everything she knew. Curiosity about the legendary city of Marduk, the gate of the gods. And beneath it all, perhaps, a quiet sorrow at saying goodbye to the mountains she loved. The journey from Ecbatana to Babylon would have taken several weeks. Amytis would have travelled with a grand entourage, servants and attendants, guards and guides, wagons loaded with her dowry of gold and cloth and precious things. The caravan would have moved slowly through the mountain passes, descending gradually toward the plains. Day by day, the landscape changed around her. First the high passes, where snow lingered in shadowed corners and the air was thin and cold. Then the lower slopes, where orchards grew and villages clung to the hillsides. Then the foothills, dry and brown, where the last trees gave way to scrubland. And finally the plain itself, that vast flat expanse stretching to every horizon, broken only by the shimmer of the rivers and the dark green ribbon of cultivation along their banks. She would have looked back often, watching the mountains shrink behind her. Each day they grew smaller, fainter, until one morning she looked, and they were gone, lost below the horizon, visible only in memory. And then, at last, she saw Babylon. It rose from the plain like a dream. Its walls stretched for miles, thick as a city block, high as a cliff. Its towers gleamed with glazed blue bricks that caught the sunlight and threw it back toward heaven. The great ziggurat rose above the city like an artificial mountain, its 7 levels painted in brilliant colors, its summit reaching toward the sky. She entered through the Ishtar Gate, that magnificent portal decorated with rows of dragons and bulls in brilliant yellow against Babylonian blue. She walked the processional way between walls of glazed lions, each one seeming to pace alongside her, guardians of the greatest city on earth. She passed through the temple precinct to the palace where her future husband waited. Nebuchadnezzar was perhaps 20 years old, young, ambitious, already a proven warrior. The alliance with Media had been his father's idea, but Nebuchadnezzar understood its importance. Babylon needed peace with its eastern neighbor to pursue its ambitions in the west. This marriage would secure that peace. We do not know if they loved each other. The ancient sources are silent on such matters, but the legend tells us that Nebuchadnezzar cared for his wife, that he saw her unhappiness in the years that followed, that he sought to ease it in the only way a king could, by building something the world had never seen. But first, there was a throne to secure and an empire to build. Before Nebuchadnezzar became history's great builder, he was a conqueror. The destruction of Assyria had not brought peace to the ancient world. It had merely created a power vacuum into which every ambitious kingdom now rushed. Egypt, in particular, saw an opportunity to expand its influence into the lands that Assyria had once controlled. The Egyptians under Pharaoh Necho II marched north through Palestine and Syria, following the ancient coastal route that armies had traveled for millennia. They occupied key cities. They established garrisons. They extended their control over the small kingdoms of the region, Judah, Phoenicia, the Philistine cities. that had long been pawns in the struggles of greater powers. Nabopolassar, growing old and unwell, sent his son to deal with the threat. In the spring of 605, before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar led the Babylonian army north. His target was Carchemish, a city on the upper Euphrates that the Egyptians had fortified as the anchor of their Syrian position. The Battle of Carchemish was one of the decisive engagements of ancient history. The details are sparse. We have only brief notices in the Babylonian chronicles and the Hebrew scriptures, but the outcome is clear. Nebuchadnezzar's forces stormed the city, driving the Egyptians from their fortifications. Then they pursued the fleeing army south, destroying it utterly at Hamath. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in Jerusalem, captured the Egyptian disaster. The nations have heard of thy shame, and thy cry hath filled the land. For the mighty man hath stumbled against the mighty, and they are fallen both together. Egypt's dream of a Syrian empire died in a single campaign. For the next 2 centuries, the Nile kingdom would remain on the defensive, fighting to preserve its own borders rather than expand them. It was at this moment of triumph that messengers reached Nebuchadnezzar with news from Babylon. His father Nabopolassar was dead. The young prince faced a difficult decision. His army was deep in Syria, hundreds of miles from home. Other members of his family might try to seize the throne before he could return. Every day he delayed increased the risk of civil war. Nebuchadnezzar abandoned his army and rode for Babylon with only a small escort. The Babylonian chronicles tell us he crossed the desert by the most direct route, a journey of perhaps 500 miles through waterless wastes. He reached Babylon in less than 3 weeks, an extraordinary feat that speaks to both the urgency of his situation and his personal toughness. He need not have worried. The Babylonians welcomed him as their rightful king. He was crowned in the temple of Marduk, the patron god of the city, and took his place on the throne that his father had won. Nebuchadnezzar II had become king of Babylon. He was perhaps 30 years old, and he would reign for 43 years, the longest reign in Babylonian history, and one of the longest in all antiquity. The early years of that reign were consumed by warfare. The victory at Carchemish had established Babylonian dominance over Syria and Palestine, but holding that dominance required constant vigilance. The Egyptians, though defeated, remained a threat. The small kingdoms of the region, Judah, Phoenicia, the Philistine cities, shifted their allegiances with every change in the political winds. Nebuchadnezzar campaigned almost annually, leading his armies west to subdue rebellions and collect tribute. He was not a cruel ruler by the standards of his time. The Assyrian practices of mass deportation and public torture were not his way. He preferred vassalage to destruction, tribute to slaughter. But when cities rebelled, his punishments could be severe. The siege of Tyre was perhaps the most famous of these campaigns. Tyre was a Phoenician city, one of the great maritime powers of the ancient world. It sat on an island off the Lebanese coast, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. Its ships traded across the Mediterranean, bringing back the wealth of distant lands. Its walls were high and strong, surrounded on all sides by water. When Tyre rebelled against Babylonian rule, Nebuchadnezzar brought his army to the shore and began a siege that would last 13 years. 13 years. For 13 years, Nebuchadnezzar's army camped on the mainland, trying to starve the island city into submission. For 13 years, Tyrian ships slipped through the blockade, bringing food and supplies from across the sea. For 13 years, the siege ground on, neither side able to force a decisive victory. In the end, Tyre submitted, but on its own terms. The city acknowledged Babylonian overlordship, accepted a Babylonian garrison, agreed to pay tribute. But it was not sacked. Its walls were not torn down. Its people were not deported. Nebuchadnezzar had won, but only barely. The prophet Ezekiel, who had predicted Tyre's total destruction, was forced to revise his prophecy. The king of Babylon caused his army to serve a great service against Tyrus, he admitted. Every head was made bald, and every shoulder was peeled. Yet had he no wages. But the most famous of Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns was not against Tyre. It was against Jerusalem. The kingdom of Judah had been an Assyrian vassal for over a century. When Assyria fell, Judah briefly tasted independence. King Josiah, a reformer remembered for his religious revival and his attempt to purge foreign worship from the land, dreamed of restoring the glories of David and Solomon. He expanded his territory, extended his influence, imagined a future in which Judah would be a power in its own right. Those dreams died with Josiah at the Battle of Megiddo, where he was killed trying to block the Egyptian advance into Syria. After him, Judah became a pawn in the struggle between Egypt and Babylon, ruled by puppet kings who owed their thrones to foreign masters. King Jehoiakim was placed on the throne by Pharaoh Necho. After the Egyptian defeat at Carchemish, he switched allegiance to Babylon. But when Nebuchadnezzar's attempt to invade Egypt was repulsed in 601, Jehoiakim saw an opportunity. He rebelled against Babylon, hoping that Egyptian support would allow him to maintain his independence. It was a catastrophic mistake. In 598, Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem. Jehoiakim died during the campaign, whether by assassination, suicide, or natural causes. The sources disagree. His young son Jehoiakim became king, but his reign lasted only 3 months. The city surrendered, its gates opening to the Babylonian army. Nebuchadnezzar's punishment was severe but calculated. He carried off the king and 10,000 of Jerusalem's leading citizens, nobles and craftsmen, soldiers and priests, to Babylon. He stripped the Temple of Solomon of its treasures. But he did not destroy the city. He did not tear down its walls or burn its buildings. Instead, he placed a puppet king on the throne, Zedekiah, an uncle of the deported Jehoiakim, and expected obedience. For 10 years, Zedekiah obeyed. But the pressure was constant. Egyptian agents whispered promises of support. Prophets in Jerusalem urged rebellion against the pagan overlord. The deportees in Babylon sent letters urging their countrymen to remain loyal, but their voices were drowned out by those who dreamed of freedom. In 589, Zedekiah rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar returned. This time, there would be no mercy. The siege of Jerusalem lasted 18 months. The Babylonian army surrounded the city, building siege works, cutting off supplies. Inside the walls, famine spread. The prophet Jeremiah, who had urged submission to Babylon as the will of God, was thrown into a cistern and left to die. He survived only because a sympathetic official pulled him out. The Book of Lamentations, traditionally attributed to Jeremiah, captures the horror of the siege. The tongue of the nursing infant sticks to the roof of its mouth for thirst. The children beg for food, but no one gives to them. Those who once feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple embrace ash heaps. In the summer of 586 or 587, the sources differ, the walls were breached. Zedekiah tried to flee through the gardens near the city, but he was captured in the plains of Jericho. He was brought before Nebuchadnezzar at Riblah in Syria. The king of Babylon forced him to watch as his sons were executed before his eyes. Then Zedekiah's eyes were put out, and he was carried off to Babylon in chains, where he died in prison. Jerusalem itself was destroyed. The walls were torn down stone by stone. The Temple of Solomon, the dwelling place of God, the heart of Israelite worship for nearly 400 years, was burned to the ground. The bronze pillars and the golden vessels, the sacred furnishings and the ark itself, all vanished, carried off to Babylon or destroyed in the flames. The remaining population was deported. Only the poorest of the land were left behind to tend the vineyards and the fields. This event, the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile, would echo through history for millennia. It was the formative trauma of Jewish identity, the catastrophe that shaped Judaism into its mature form. The prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel witnessed it. The Psalms mourned it. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down, we wept, when we remembered Zion. For Nebuchadnezzar, it was simply another campaign, another rebellion crushed. He returned to Babylon with his prisoners and his spoils to continue the great work of building his capital. Among those prisoners, according to the book of Daniel, was a young man who would rise to prominence in the Babylonian court. Daniel, the interpreter of dreams, the reader of signs. But that is another story. Among the captives who walked the long road from Jerusalem to Babylon were the poets. They carried no weapons, these poets. They possessed no wealth that the Babylonians might covet. What they carried was something far more durable than bronze or gold. They carried memory. They carried the stories of their people, the psalms sung in the temple, the prophecies spoken by men who claimed to hear the voice of God. And they carried their grief. The book of Psalms preserves their sorrow. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, we wept, when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? The exiles settled along the canals of Babylon, those artificial waterways that crisscrossed the plain, carrying the waters of the Euphrates to distant fields. The Babylonians called them Naharotu. The exiles heard an echo of their own word for rivers, Nero. By these waters they made their homes, built their houses, planted their gardens. They learned the Babylonian language, that ancient tongue written in wedge-shaped marks on tablets of clay. They adopted Babylonian customs, the calendar with its months named for Babylonian festivals, the system of weights and measures, the ways of commerce and law. Their children grew up bilingual, speaking Aramaic at home and Babylonian in the streets, and yet they did not forget Jerusalem. The priests among them continued to teach the ancient traditions. The scribes preserved the sacred texts, copying them carefully, generation after generation. The prophets, Ezekiel by the canal called Shabbat, Daniel in the palace of the king, continued to speak words they claimed came from God. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, the psalm continues, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. The exile lasted 70 years, as the prophet Jeremiah had foretold. During those 7 decades, a generation was born who had never seen Jerusalem, who knew the Temple of Solomon only from the stories of their parents and grandparents. For them, Babylon was not exile but home, the only home they had ever known. Some of them prospered. The Babylonians were not cruel masters, by the standards of the ancient world. They allowed the exiles considerable freedom to worship their God, to maintain their customs, to engage in trade and acquire property. The book of Ezra tells us that when Cyrus the Persian finally allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, many chose to stay in Babylon. They had built lives there, established businesses, raised families. The land of exile had become their land. Did any of these exiles see the hanging gardens? We cannot know. The Hebrew scriptures, focused on matters of worship and prophecy, say nothing of Babylonian gardens. But we can imagine a Jewish scribe walking the streets of Babylon on some errand, glancing toward the palace complex and seeing that impossible mountain of green. We can imagine him stopping, staring, wondering at the power of a king who could make water flow uphill. Perhaps he thought of the Garden of Eden, that paradise from which humanity was expelled. Perhaps he saw in the Hanging Gardens an echo of that first garden, a human attempt to recreate what God alone could create. Or perhaps he simply marveled, as anyone would marvel, at the beauty and ingenuity of the thing. The Jews eventually returned to Jerusalem. They rebuilt their temple. They restored their worship. But something of Babylon stayed with them forever. Words and customs, calendar and script, absorbed during those 70 years by the rivers of Babylon. And something of their sorrow stayed with Babylon. The psalm they sang by the canals would outlast the empire that had carried them into exile. Long after the gardens had crumbled and the walls had fallen, long after Babylon itself became a memory, that psalm would be sung in synagogues and churches, in concert halls and bedrooms, by the rivers of 1,000 different lands, by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down. Yeah, we wept. To understand the Hanging Gardens, we must first understand the city that contained them. Babylon was not merely a city. It was an idea of what civilization could be, what human beings could achieve when they worked together in great numbers over long periods of time. The city sat astride the Euphrates, which flowed through its center, dividing it into western and eastern halves connected by a great stone bridge. This location was not accidental. The river provided water for drinking and irrigation, a highway for trade, a moat for defense. It was the lifeline of the city, the reason Babylon existed at all. Along the river, quays and wharves stretched for miles. Ships arrived daily from the Persian Gulf, bringing goods from India and Arabia, spices and incense, pearls and precious stones, exotic woods and rare animals. Other ships came from the north, carrying timber from the mountains, metals from the highland mines, wine and oil from distant provinces. The markets of Babylon were famous throughout the ancient world. The Greek historian Herodotus described them in detail: the merchants in their stalls, the shoppers haggling over prices, the bewildering variety of goods from every corner of the known world. You could buy silk from China, ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic. You could purchase slaves from 12 different peoples, each with their own skills and languages. The city was organized into quarters, each with its own character. There were residential districts where the common people lived, their small houses crowded together along narrow lanes. There were temple precincts, where the great religious institutions dominated entire neighborhoods. There were industrial areas where craftsmen worked, potters and weavers, smiths and carpenters, all the trades that kept a great city functioning. And there was the palace district, where the king and his court resided in splendor unimaginable to the common people. The palace district occupied a vast area along the river, protected by its own walls within the greater walls of the city. Here Nebuchadnezzar had built his southern palace, with its famous throne room and its endless corridors. Here stood the administrative buildings where scribes kept the records of empire. Here were the barracks of the royal guard, the storehouses of the treasury, the archives where treaties and laws were preserved. And here, somewhere, if the legends are true, rose the Hanging Gardens. The gardens would have been visible from throughout the palace district. Courtiers going about their business would have glimpsed them through windows and doorways. Visitors approaching the palace would have seen them rising against the sky, a green mountain in the heart of the city. They would have been a constant presence, a daily reminder of the king's power and the queen's homesickness, of love and engineering, and the triumph of human will over nature. With his wars largely won, Nebuchadnezzar turned his attention to the city he loved. Babylon in the early 6th century was already ancient. The site had been occupied for at least 2,000 years. Great kings, Hammurabi, the Kassites, the earlier Nebuchadnezzar, had built and rebuilt the city over the centuries. but none had ever built on the scale that Nebuchadnezzar II now contemplated. The king's inscriptions, preserved on clay cylinders found by archaeologists, describe his building projects in obsessive detail. They have a formulaic quality. These inscriptions, ritual invocations to the gods, lists of achievements, prayers for long life and prosperity. But through the formulas, we glimpse the scope of Nebuchadnezzar's ambition. He rebuilt the walls of Babylon, making them the most formidable fortifications in the ancient world. The inner wall was 21 feet thick, reinforced with towers at regular intervals. The outer wall was 11 feet thick, separated from the inner wall by a space of 23 feet that could be filled with rubble in case of siege. Beyond the outer wall, a moat connected to the Euphrates added yet another layer of defense. The walls stretched for miles, enclosing an area of unprecedented size. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed they were 56 miles in circumference, though modern scholars believe this was an exaggeration. Even so, the walled area of Babylon was enormous, perhaps 3 square miles, large enough to contain fields and orchards as well as houses and temples. Nebuchadnezzar paved the processional way with limestone slabs, each one inscribed with his name and titles. He rebuilt the Ishtar Gate, covering its surface with glazed bricks in brilliant blue, decorated with rows of lions, bulls, and dragons in raised relief. The animals seemed to march alongside visitors as they entered the city, an eternal procession of beasts in yellow and white against the blue. He raised the great ziggurat, the Atemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. This step pyramid rose in 7 levels, each painted a different color, each dedicated to a different deity. At its summit stood a temple of blue glazed brick, where the god Marduk was set to descend during the New Year festival to bless the city. The Atemenanki was probably the inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The Hebrew name Babel is simply a form of Babylon, and the description of a tower reaching toward heaven matches what we know of the Great Ziggurat. The biblical story presents the tower as an act of human pride, punished by God with the confusion of languages. The Babylonians saw it differently, as an act of devotion, a stairway on which the gods could descend to walk among their people. But the greatest of Nebuchadnezzar's buildings was his palace, or rather, his palaces, for he built several. The southern palace covered a vast area in the heart of the city. Its walls were thick enough to resist any siege engine known to the ancient world. Its gates were plated with bronze. Its throne room was decorated with glazed bricks in the same brilliant blue that covered the Ishtar Gate, patterned with images of lions and columns. The throne room itself was enormous, 170 feet long, over 50 feet wide, its ceiling supported by massive wooden beams from the cedars of Lebanon. Here Nebuchadnezzar would have received ambassadors from every corner of the known world, seated on his throne of gold and ivory, surrounded by courtiers and guards. Within the palace walls lay hundreds of rooms, audience halls and archives, storerooms and barracks, gardens and courtyards. There were quarters for the royal family, for the administrators who ran the empire, for the servants and slaves who maintained the household. There were kitchens and workshops, stables and armories. The palace was a world unto itself, capable of functioning indefinitely even if the city around it fell. Beyond the southern palace, Nebuchadnezzar built other residences. The summer palace, far to the north at a place called Babel, offered escape from the worst of the summer heat. A fortified structure known as the Northern Palace guarded the approach to the city from that direction, and somewhere, according to the legends, he built the Hanging Gardens. Babylon sat at the crossroads of the world. From the east, caravans arrived along the ancient road from Persia. They crossed the high passes of the Zagros Mountains, descended to the plains of Mesopotamia, and followed the rivers south to the great city. They brought goods from even farther east, the silks of China, the spices of India, The lapis lazuli of Afghanistan, treasures carried thousands of miles by traders who never saw their final destination. From the west, merchants came from the Mediterranean world. Phoenician traders brought the purple dye that made Tyre famous, the glass that Sidon produced, the cedar wood of Lebanon that Nebuchadnezzar prized for his buildings. Greek traders brought olive oil and wine, pottery and metalwork, the products of a civilization that was just beginning to rise. From the south, ships sailed up the Persian Gulf, bringing the wealth of Arabia, frankincense and myrrh, gold and precious stones, exotic animals and aromatic woods. The sailors navigated by the stars, following routes their ancestors had traveled for generations. From the north came copper and tin, iron and silver, the metals that made civilization possible. Mountain peoples brought these raw materials down from the highlands, trading them for the grain and textiles that only the lowland cities could produce. All these goods flowed through Babylon. The city's markets were the greatest in the world, vast bazaars where you could buy anything imaginable. Merchants from a dozen different lands haggled in a dozen different languages, each seeking advantage, each hoping to return home richer than they came. The hanging gardens, if they existed, would have been planted with specimens from all these far-flung places. Cedar from Lebanon and roses from Persia, pomegranates from the Mediterranean and date palms from the southern oases. The garden was a kind of map of the known world, each plant representing a different land, a different climate, a different corner of Nebuchadnezzar's vast empire. In a sense, walking through the garden was like walking through the world itself, experiencing in one place the botanical treasures of many places, brought together through the power and reach of Babylonian civilization. We do not know when Nebuchadnezzar built the hanging gardens. We do not know where they stood, or how large they were, or what they looked like. We do not know if they were built for a metis or for some other purpose. We do not even know, with certainty, that they existed at all. What we have are the accounts of Greek and Roman writers, most of whom lived centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's death. They describe the gardens in vivid detail, but they often contradict each other. Some say the gardens were square. Others say they were oblong. Some say they were 400 feet on each side. Others give different measurements. Some say they rose to a height of 75 feet. Others are vague about dimensions. Let us gather these accounts together and see what picture emerges. The earliest surviving account comes from Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote a history of his homeland in Greek around 290 before the Common Era. Berossus had access to the temple archives of Babylon, and his account carries the weight of native tradition. In this palace, he wrote, Nebuchadnezzar erected lofty stone terraces, in which he closely reproduced mountain scenery, planting them with all kinds of trees and constructing the so-called hanging garden, because his wife, who had been raised in the region of Media, longed for her native surroundings. This is the foundation of the legend, a love story, told by a Babylonian priest 3 centuries after the fact. We cannot know where Berossus got this information. Perhaps it was genuine tradition, passed down in the temples. Perhaps it was romantic speculation, an attempt to explain a monument whose true origins had been forgotten. Either way, the story caught the imagination of the ancient world. Later writers elaborated on Berossus's account. The most detailed description comes from Diodorus Siculus, a Greek historian who wrote in the 1st century before the Common Era. The garden, Diodorus wrote, was 400 feet on each side. The approach to the garden sloped like a hillside, and the several parts of the structure rose from one another tier upon tier. On all this, the earth had been piled and was thickly planted with trees of every kind that, by their great size or any other charm, could give pleasure to the beholder. Diodorus described the construction in some detail. The pillars, which were hollow and filled with earth to allow the deepest rooting trees to grow, were constructed of baked brick and asphalt. The ascent to the highest story was by stairs, and alongside the stairs, water engines raised water in great abundance from the river, although no one outside could see it being done. That last phrase is significant. Although no one outside could see it being done, the gardens were not merely a garden. They were an illusion, a magic trick on a grand scale. The machinery that kept them alive was hidden from view. Visitors saw only the miracle: green growing things, reaching toward the sky, watered by streams that seemed to flow from nowhere. The geographer Strabo, writing around the same time, added further details. The garden is quadrilateral in shape, he wrote, and each side is 4 plethra in length. It consists of vaulted terraces, raised one above another, and resting upon cube-shaped pillars. These are hollow and filled with earth to allow trees of the largest size to be planted. Strabo described the engineering with evident admiration. The pillars, the vaults, and the terraces are constructed of baked brick and asphalt. The ascent to the highest story is by stairs, and at their side are water engines, by means of which persons appointed expressly for the purpose are continually employed in raising water from the Euphrates into the garden. The final major source is Philo of Byzantium, who compiled a list of the 7 wonders of the world around 225 before the Common Era. His description is perhaps the most evocative. The hanging garden, Philo wrote, has plants cultivated above ground level, and the roots of the trees are embedded in an upper terrace rather than in the earth. This is the technique of its construction. The whole mass is supported on stone columns. Streams of water emerging from elevated sources flow down sloping channels. These waters irrigate the whole garden, saturating the roots of plants and keeping the whole area moist. Hence the grass is permanently green, and the leaves of trees grow firmly attached to supple branches. Permanently green. In a land where everything turned brown under the summer sun, where dust covered every surface, where the only relief from the monotonous palette of the plain was the dark green band of vegetation along the river. In such a land, a garden that was permanently green would have seemed miraculous. From these accounts, we can imagine what the gardens might have looked like. Let us consider what it would have taken to build such a thing. The challenges were immense. Babylon sits in one of the driest climates on Earth. The summer temperatures routinely exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes reaching 115 or even higher. The annual rainfall averages less than 6 inches, most of which falls in winter, when it is least useful for growing things. The soil of the Mesopotamian plain is not naturally suited for gardens. It is heavy clay, prone to cracking in the summer heat, becoming waterlogged in the winter rains. Without constant irrigation, almost nothing will grow. With too much irrigation, salt accumulates, poisoning the earth. And yet the ancient writers describe a garden of extraordinary lushness, trees of the largest size, grass that was permanently green, flowers and shrubs and vines in profusion. Creating such a garden at ground level would have been difficult enough. Creating it on terraces raised high above the city, exposed to the full force of the Mesopotamian sun, would have required engineering of the highest order. The first challenge was structural. How do you build a platform strong enough to support the weight of earth and trees, high enough to create the impression of a mountain, stable enough to resist the forces of water and roots? The ancient sources describe a foundation of stone, not the mud brick that composed most Babylonian buildings, but actual quarried stone, rare and precious in this riverine land. Upon this foundation rose columns, closely spaced, supporting vaulted arches. The vaults in turn supported the terraces, broad platforms of brick, sloping gently to allow drainage. The columns, according to Strabo, were hollow and filled with earth. This was a clever solution to the problem of weight. A solid platform of earth, thick enough for full-grown trees, would have been enormously heavy, but hollow columns, essentially giant planters, distributed the weight more efficiently. The trees would root in the columns themselves, their branches spreading outward over the vaulted spaces below. Above the structural elements, the builders had to create a waterproof membrane. This was crucial. The terraces were built of brick, and brick, especially the mud brick that was standard in Mesopotamia, dissolves in water. A garden, by definition, requires water. Without some way to keep that water from seeping into the structure, the whole edifice would eventually collapse. The ancient sources mention baked brick and asphalt. Baked brick, fired in kilns rather than merely dried in the sun, is far more resistant to water than ordinary mud brick. The Babylonians used it for their most important structures, including the processional way and the foundations of temples. Asphalt, called bitumen in ancient sources, occurred naturally in Mesopotamia, seeping from the earth in places where petroleum deposits lay close to the surface. The Babylonians had used it for waterproofing since prehistoric times. They sealed boats with it, lined cisterns with it, used it as mortar in their most important buildings. A layer of baked brick, sealed with asphalt, would have created a waterproof platform upon which the garden could grow. The water that irrigated the plants would trickle down through the soil, hit the waterproof layer, and drain through carefully designed channels to the level below. The structure would remain dry and stable. But the greatest engineering challenge was not structural. It was hydraulic. How do you get water to the top of a 75-foot structure? Water, left to itself, flows downhill. It seeks the lowest point, the easiest path. It does not climb mountains or scale walls. To make water flow upward requires work, energy applied against the natural tendency of things. The ancient sources describe machinery, water engines, screws, devices of bronze and wood that lifted water from the Euphrates to the highest terraces of the garden. The exact nature of this machinery is unclear. The sources speak in general terms, mentioning screws and wheels and chains without providing detailed descriptions. One possibility is the Archimedes screw, a helical blade inside a cylinder that, when turned, draws water upward. The device is simple and elegant, capable of lifting water to considerable heights with relatively little effort. Archimedes, the famous Greek mathematician and inventor, is traditionally credited with inventing it in the 3rd century before the Common Era. But if the Babylonians used such devices in the Hanging Gardens, they anticipated Archimedes by 300 years. This is not as unlikely as it might seem. The peoples of Mesopotamia had been managing water for millennia. Their canal systems were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. They understood hydraulics in ways that would not be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. And we have evidence that screw-like devices were known in Mesopotamia long before Archimedes. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, who reigned around 700 before the Common Era, a century before Nebuchadnezzar, left inscriptions describing what he called bronze screws used to raise water for his palace gardens at Nineveh. Another possibility is the chain pump, an endless loop of buckets or scoops attached to a chain or rope, driven by a wheel. As the wheel turns, the buckets descend into the water source, fill, and rise again, emptying their contents into a channel at the top. The process is continuous, requiring only steady motion to maintain a constant flow. Chain pumps are simpler than screws, but require more labor to operate. They would have been driven by oxen or slaves, walking in endless circles to turn the wheels that lifted water to the gardens above. The ancient sources mention people appointed expressly for this purpose, employed continuously in raising water from the Euphrates. We can imagine the sound of the machinery, the creak of wheels, the splash of water, the patient footsteps of the oxen in their endless rounds. We can imagine the channels that carried water from the pumps to the gardens, clay pipes or stone conduits, running beneath the soil, hidden from view. We can imagine the fountains and streams that distributed water across each terrace, trickling through beds of flowers, pooling at the feet of trees, creating the constant music of flowing water that visitors described. The engineering was remarkable. But engineering alone does not make a wonder. The wonder of the Hanging Gardens was not just their structure. It was what grew upon them. The ancient writers describe gardens of extraordinary diversity, trees of every kind, plants from distant lands, flowers and shrubs and vines in profusion. Nebuchadnezzar, they say, gathered specimens from every corner of his empire to create a garden that would remind Amytis of her mountain homeland. We cannot know exactly what grew in the Hanging Gardens. No complete list survives, if any was ever made, but we can imagine, based on what we know of Babylonian horticulture and the plants that would have been available in the 6th century before the Common Era. First, there would have been the trees. Cedars from Lebanon, those massive conifers with their dark needled branches and their scent of mountains. The cedar had been prized in Mesopotamia since prehistoric times. The cedar forests of Lebanon were perhaps the most valuable resource in the ancient Near East, their timber essential for the temples and palaces of every great kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar himself boasts in his inscriptions of bringing cedars from Lebanon to roof the temples of Marduk. Cypresses, those tall columnar trees that point toward heaven like green spires. The cypress was sacred in many ancient cultures, associated with death and eternity, with the passage from this world to the next. In a garden, they would have provided vertical accents, breaking up the horizontal lines of the terraces with their aspiring forms. Pines and firs from the mountain regions, trees that Amytis would have known from her childhood in Media. These conifers, with their evergreen needles and their resinous scent, would have flourished in the well-watered environment of the garden, reminding the queen of the forests of her homeland. Among the conifers, deciduous trees would have spread their branches. Oaks and beeches, the trees of the highland forests. Willows and poplars, which grow naturally along the rivers of Mesopotamia. Plane trees, with their spreading canopies and their mottled bark. Date palms, the quintessential tree of the region, laden with their sweet fruit. And fruit trees. The gardens would have been filled with fruit trees. Pomegranates, with their hard red shells and their ruby seeds. The pomegranate was sacred across the ancient Near East, a symbol of fertility and abundance. Its flowers are bright orange-red, beautiful in themselves before the fruit even forms. Figs, those ancient trees that mankind had cultivated since the beginning of agriculture. The fig tree produces fruit twice a year, an early crop in spring, a main crop in late summer, and its broad leaves provide welcome shade in the hot Mesopotamian sun. Almonds and pistachios, those nuts that grow wild in the mountains of Media and Persia. They would have been familiar to Amytis, foods of her childhood, and their spring blossoms, pink for almonds, greenish for pistachios, would have brightened the garden terraces. Apples and pears and quinces, fruits that originated in the mountains of Central Asia. By Nebuchadnezzar's time, they had been cultivated in the Near East for millennia, and the Babylonians would have known how to grow them, though they would have required more water than the native date palms. Beneath the trees, the gardens would have been planted with shrubs and flowers. Roses. The rose has been cultivated in Persia and Mesopotamia since ancient times. The Persian word for rose, gul, is one of the oldest words in any language. The gardens would have been thick with roses, red and pink and white, single and double, climbing and bushing, their perfume filling the air on summer evenings. Jasmine, that night-blooming vine whose small white flowers release an intoxicating fragrance after dark. Jasmine was native to the mountains of Iran and northern India, within the trading networks of the Babylonian Empire. Its scent, mingling with the roses, would have transformed the gardens into a place of sensory delight. Lilies and irises, those elegant flowers that grow from bulbs. The lily was associated with purity and royalty across the ancient world. The iris, named for the Greek goddess of the rainbow, comes in every color imaginable. Both would have thrived in the well-watered soils of the hanging terraces. And herbs! The Babylonians were great cultivators of herbs, for medicine, for cooking, for perfume. The gardens would have included beds of mint and marjoram, of basil and thyme, of coriander and cumin. Their leaves would have released their scents when touched, adding another layer to the sensory experience of walking the terraces. On the terraces, we might imagine grass, real grass, green and soft, kept alive by the constant flow of water through hidden channels. Grass was rare in Babylon. The heat and drought of summer turned everything brown. To walk barefoot on green grass in the middle of a Mesopotamian summer would have been an almost miraculous experience. And climbing the walls and trellises, vines, grapevines, their fruit hanging in heavy clusters, purple and green and gold. The Babylonians cultivated grapes, though their hot climate made wine production difficult. In the cooler, moister environment of the gardens, grapes would have thrived. Honeysuckle, with its sweet-scented flowers that attract bees and butterflies. Bougainvillea, whose brilliant purple and pink and red bracts would have cascaded down the terrace walls like frozen waterfalls of color. Ivy, that ancient plant that clings to walls and trees, creating curtains of green wherever it grows. The ivy would have softened the hard edges of the architecture, making the stone terraces look like natural hillsides. This was the garden that Nebuchadnezzar built for his queen, or so the legend tells us. A garden of trees and flowers, of fruit and fragrance, of green and growing things in the middle of a brown and dusty plain, a piece of media transplanted to Babylon. A gift of love. Babylon was not only a city of wonders, it was a city of wisdom. For more than 1,000 years, the scribes of Mesopotamia had studied the heavens. They watched the movements of the stars, night after night, year after year, recording their observations on tablets of clay. They tracked the wandering of the planets, those lights that moved against the fixed background of stars. They noted the phases of the moon, the risings and settings of the sun, the rare occasions when moon or sun went dark. From these observations, they created the first systematic astronomy. The Babylonian astronomers divided the sky into 12 sections, each marked by a constellation. These are the signs of the zodiac: Aries and Taurus, Gemini and Cancer, and the rest, names that have come down to us through Greek and Latin, but which originated in the temples of Babylon. They divided the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds. These divisions, based on the Babylonian system of counting by 60s, we still use today. They could predict eclipses. They knew the cycles of the moon so precisely that they could calculate, years in advance, when the silver disk would vanish from the sky. They tracked the movements of Venus with such accuracy that their observations are still useful to modern astronomers. This was not mere curiosity. The Babylonians believed that the heavens spoke. The gods communicated through signs in the sky, through the positions of planets, the colors of the moon, the appearance of comets and meteors. The king's astrologers watched the heavens constantly, interpreting what they saw, advising the king on matters of war and peace, harvest and famine. In the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, these wise men held positions of honor. The book of Daniel describes them: the magicians and astrologers, the sorcerers and Chaldeans who served in the king's court. When Nebuchadnezzar had a dream he could not understand, it was to these wise men that he turned. They practiced other arts as well. Mathematics, essential for the calculations of astronomy and the demands of administration. Medicine, with its elaborate systems of diagnosis and treatment. Divination, reading the future in the livers of sacrificed animals or the patterns of oil on water. Magic, both to invoke blessings and to ward off evil. And they preserved knowledge. The temple libraries of Babylon held thousands of tablets, collections of omens and rituals, dictionaries and word lists, mathematical problems and astronomical records. These were copied and recopied, generation after generation, preserving the accumulated wisdom of millennia. When the Greeks came to Babylon, centuries later, they found this wisdom still being taught. They studied Babylonian astronomy, adapting it to their own theories. They learned Babylonian mathematics, incorporating it into their own traditions. The scientific knowledge of the ancient world flowed from Babylon into Greece, from Greece into Rome, from Rome into the medieval Islamic world, and from there into modern Europe. In a very real sense, the Hanging Gardens, if they existed, were products of this wisdom. They required mathematical calculations to design the terraces, to plan the irrigation systems, to determine the loads that columns and vaults could bear. They required astronomical knowledge to orient the gardens, to plan for the seasons, to predict when water would be most needed. They required engineering wisdom accumulated over centuries of managing the rivers of Mesopotamia. The gardens were not merely beautiful. They were a triumph of knowledge over nature, of human understanding over the raw material of the world. The Babylonians wrote on clay. It seems strange to us, accustomed as we are to paper and screens, to imagine a civilization that recorded its thoughts in mud. But clay was everywhere in Mesopotamia, free for the taking, easy to work, remarkably durable when dried or fired. A scribe would take a lump of wet clay, shape it into a tablet, and press marks into its surface with a reed stylus. The marks were wedge-shaped, cuneiform, we call them, from the Latin word for wedge. Different combinations of wedges represented different sounds, which combined to form words, which combined to form the records of civilization. The scribes of Babylon wrote everything. They wrote receipts for grain delivered to temples. They wrote contracts for the sale of houses and slaves. They wrote letters from merchants to their agents in distant cities. They wrote laws and treaties, myths and poems, astronomical observations and mathematical calculations. And they wrote about gardens. We have tablets that list the plants grown in Babylonian gardens, their names, their properties, their uses in medicine and ritual. We have tablets that describe the layout of royal gardens, the arrangements of trees and flowers, the placement of pools and fountains. We have tablets that record the wages paid to gardeners, the supplies purchased for maintenance, the administrative details that kept the gardens running. But we have no tablet that clearly describes the Hanging Gardens. This is the mystery at the heart of our story. The Babylonians wrote everything down. They were obsessive record keepers, preserving every detail of their civilization in clay that has survived to our own time. And yet, of the wonder that the Greeks called one of the 7 marvels of the world, the Babylonian tablets say nothing. There are possible explanations. The tablets may have been lost, destroyed by fire or flood, scattered by looters, dissolved by the elements. The tablets may still be buried, waiting to be discovered in some unexcavated corner of the ruins. The tablets may be in museum collections, not yet deciphered, their secrets hidden in the wedge-shaped marks. Or the Hanging Gardens may have been a legend, a story that grew in the telling, a wonder that existed only in the imagination of those who heard about Babylon from afar. The clay tablets of Babylon preserve many truths. The truth of the Hanging Gardens they did not preserve, or at least, have not yet revealed. Let us walk now through the gardens themselves. Imagine that it is a summer morning in Babylon. The year is 580 before the Common Era. Nebuchadnezzar has reigned for a quarter century. His wars are largely won. His building projects are nearing completion. The city has reached the height of its glory. You have risen early to escape the heat that will come later. The sun is just climbing above the eastern walls, its light golden and slanting. The streets are beginning to stir, merchants opening their shops, servants carrying water from the wells, priests making their way to the temples for the morning sacrifices. You are a visitor to Babylon, a merchant from the west, perhaps, or a diplomat from some vassal kingdom. You have heard of the wonders of the city, and you have come to see them for yourself. The walls and gates, the temples and palaces have all impressed you. But there is one more wonder to see. A servant leads you through the palace complex, through courtyards and corridors, past guards and officials, until you reach a gateway in the western wall. Beyond the gateway, something rises against the morning sky, a green mass, a mountain of vegetation, impossibly lush against the brown Babylonian landscape. The hanging gardens. From the outside, they look like a green hill, terraces rising tier upon tier, each one thick with plants. Trees reach toward the sky, their branches spreading in canopies of shade. Vines cascade down the terrace walls, trailing curtains of leaves and flowers. And everywhere, even from here, you can see the glint and shimmer of water. You can hear it too. The sound of water is constant, splashing, trickling, gurgling. It sounds like a mountain stream, like the rivers of legend that flow through the garden of the gods. The servant leads you through the gateway. You step into shadow, the shadow of the lowest terrace, supported by rows of massive columns. The stone is cool to the touch. The air smells of earth and growing things, green and damp, utterly unlike the dusty streets outside. You stand for a moment, letting your eyes adjust. The light filters down through gaps between the terraces above, falling in golden shafts upon mossy stones and clusters of fern. Small channels run along the floor, carrying the overflow from the gardens above. The water catches the light, glittering as it flows. The servant leads you to a stairway carved into the rock. The stairs are broad and shallow, easy to climb. As you ascend, the light grows stronger. The air grows warmer. The scent of earth gives way to the perfume of flowers. You emerge onto the first terrace, and you stop to catch your breath. Before you stretches a garden that seems to have no end. Trees grow in ordered rows, cedars with their dark needles, cypresses with their columnar forms, oaks with their spreading branches. The ground beneath them is not bare earth, but grass, green grass, soft beneath your sandals, kept alive by the constant flow of water through hidden channels. You slip off your sandals and feel the grass beneath your feet. It is cool and slightly damp. You have never felt anything like it in Babylon, where every public space is either paved with brick or baked by the sun to hodpan. The sensation is almost shocking, as if you have stepped into another world. You follow a path that winds between the plantings. The path is paved with smooth stones, comfortable under your bare feet. It curves gently, never offering a long straight view, always promising something new around the next bend. On either side, flower beds bloom in colors you have rarely seen. Roses, dozens of varieties, red and pink and white and yellow. Lilies opening their cups to the sky. Irises in every shade of purple and blue. Jasmine climbing a wooden trellis, its white flowers not yet open in the morning light, waiting for evening to release their fragrance. Bees move among the blossoms, their hum a counterpoint to the ever-present sound of water. Butterflies drift on the warm hair, yellow and white and iridescent blue. Birds sing from the branches of the cedars, not the ravens and sparrows of the city streets, but songbirds, deliberately introduced to complete the illusion of a wild garden. You round a corner and find a fountain. Water jets from the mouths of bronze lions into a circular basin of polished granite. The basin overflows into a channel that runs beside the path, disappearing among the roots of a pomegranate tree. The water is cool when you trail your fingers through it, cool as mountain snow. Courtiers have gathered near the fountain, lounging on cushions in the shade of a spreading fig tree. They drink wine from silver cups. They eat dates and figs, almonds and pistachios. They laugh at some private joke, their voices soft in the morning stillness. One of them notices you and gestures you over. You are offered a cup of wine, cooled in the waters of the fountain itself. You drink. It is sweet and light, flavored with something you cannot identify, some herb or flower from the garden. You ask about the gardens. The courtier smiles. "This is nothing," he says. "Wait until you see the upper terraces." You continue your ascent, climbing from level to level, each one revealing new wonders. One terrace is devoted to fruit trees. Pomegranates hang heavy with ripening fruit, their skins just beginning to show the deep red of maturity. Figs split with sweetness on the branches. Apples and pears grow in neat rows, their fruit not yet ripe but promising harvest in autumn. A servant offers you a date, fresh from the palm, sweet and moist, nothing like the dried dates you have eaten in your homeland. Another terrace is a rock garden. Great stones have been arranged to suggest a mountain landscape, boulders and outcrops, clefts and hollows. Among the rocks grow alpine plants, small hardy things with tiny leaves and bright flowers. A stream trickles among the stones, pooling in basins where goldfish swim in lazy circles. Another terrace is a water garden. Pools and channels crisscross the space, connected by small bridges and stepping stones. Lotus flowers bloom on the water's surface, pink and white, their petals opening to the sun. Water lilies spread their pads like green platters. Reeds and rushes grow along the margins, rustling in the breeze. You climb higher. The city spreads out below you, a maze of streets and rooftops, temples and markets, the brown Euphrates winding through it, all like a serpent of mud. You can see the great ziggurat from here, rising in colored steps toward heaven. You can see the walls stretching away to the horizon, guarding the greatest city on earth. And you are above it all. You stand in a garden that floats in the sky, surrounded by green-growing things, cooled by the constant presence of water. The heat of the day is building now, but here on the terraces, the shade of the trees and the moisture of the fountains keep the air pleasant. You reach the highest terrace. It is smaller than the ones below, more intimate. A pavilion stands at its center, a small building of white stone, open on all sides to catch the breeze. Couches draped with silk invite visitors to rest. Wine and fruit stand ready on a low table. You recline on a couch. The silk is smooth against your skin. Through the columns, you can see the entire garden spread out below you, terrace upon terrace, a cascade of green tumbling down to the city streets. Beyond the garden, the city. Beyond the city, the walls. Beyond the walls, the brown plain stretching to every horizon. A servant fans you with a palm frond. Another offers a cup of sherbet, crushed ice and fruit juice, brought from the mountains far to the north. You drink. The cold is startling, almost painful, utterly delicious. You think of the queen from Media, the mountain princess who came to this flat, brown land as a bride. You think of the king who built this wonder for her, this impossible gift of love, and you understand, perhaps for the first time, why it is called a wonder of the world. Who maintained the hanging gardens? The ancient sources mention them only briefly, people appointed expressly for the purpose, continually employed in raising water from the Euphrates. But behind this brief mention lies a world of labor that made the gardens possible. First, there were the water carriers. These were the workers who operated the machinery that lifted water from the river to the highest terraces. Day and night, in shifts, they turned the wheels that drove the chain pumps, walked the endless circles that lifted bucket after bucket of cool water from the Euphrates. It was exhausting work. The Mesopotamian summer is brutal, temperatures often exceeding 100 degrees, the air thick with dust, the sun beating down without mercy. The workers would have labored in the coolest hours, before dawn and after dusk, avoiding the worst of the midday heat. But even so, the work would have been hard, monotonous, never-ending. They may have been slaves. Slavery was common in the ancient world, and the tedious labor of the waterworks would have been readily assigned to those who had no choice. Prisoners of war, debtors who had sold themselves to pay their debts, children born to enslaved parents, all might have found themselves walking the endless rounds of the water wheels. Or they may have been free workers, hired for wages, proud of their essential role in maintaining one of the wonders of the world. We cannot know. The sources tell us nothing of their names, their lives, their feelings about the work they did. But we can imagine them. Imagine a young man, perhaps 18 years old, assigned to the night shift at the water wheels. He arrives as the sun is setting, the sky turning orange and purple over the river. The day shift workers are just finishing, their bodies glistening with sweat, their faces weary. He takes his place at the wheel. An ox stands beside him, harnessed to a beam that turns the mechanism. Together, man and beast begin to walk, round and round, hour after hour, while the buckets rise and fall, carrying water to the gardens above. He cannot see the gardens from here. He is below them, in the shadow of the terraces, surrounded by the creak of wood and splash of water. But he knows they are there. He knows that somewhere above him, trees are drinking the water he lifts, flowers are blooming, the queen is walking through moonlit paths. Perhaps he takes pride in this. Perhaps he tells himself that he is part of something magnificent, that his labor feeds a wonder of the world. Or perhaps he simply endures, counting the hours until his shift ends and he can sleep. Above the water carriers worked the gardeners. These would have been skilled workers, men and women who understood plants, who knew which species needed full sun and which preferred shade, who could diagnose diseases and treat infestations, who understood the subtle art of pruning and training. Some might have been specialists in particular plants. A rose gardener, perhaps, responsible for the dozens of varieties that bloomed on the middle terraces. A tree surgeon, who climbed into the branches of the cedars to remove dead wood and shape the canopy. An herbalist, who tended the beds of medicinal plants and harvested their leaves and roots for the palace physicians. They would have worked in the early morning, before the heat became unbearable. They would have carried their tools with them, bronze pruning shears, copper hoes, woven baskets for carrying cuttings and weeds. They would have known every path and terrace, every plant and fountain, as intimately as they knew their own homes. Perhaps some of them had worked in the gardens for decades. Perhaps there were families of gardeners, passing their knowledge from parent to child, each generation learning the secrets of the terraces from the generation before. And below the gardens, in workshops and storerooms, still other workers labored, the craftsmen who maintained the waterworks, replacing worn buckets, repairing broken chains, keeping the bronze screws turning smoothly, the masons who repaired the terrace walls when they cracked, the plasterers who maintained the waterproof coatings, the makers of pipes and conduits, whose work kept the hidden channels flowing. The hanging gardens were not merely a building. They were a living thing, requiring constant care, constant attention, constant labor. For every hour of beauty that visitors enjoyed, 100 hours of work went into maintaining that beauty. The visitors saw magic. The workers knew the truth. The hanging gardens changed with the seasons. In spring, The gardens would have awakened from the relative dormancy of winter. The deciduous trees, the oaks and beeches, the willows and poplars, would have put forth new leaves, pale green and tender. The roses would have begun their first bloom, covering the terraces in waves of color. The air would have been thick with the scent of orange blossoms, of jasmine, of 100 flowering plants responding to the lengthening days. The birds would have been especially active in spring. Songbirds would have built their nests in the branches, filling the morning hours with their calls. Swallows would have arrived from their winter grounds, wheeling and diving among the terraces, catching insects on the wing. The hum of bees would have been constant, as the insects moved from flower to flower, gathering nectar and spreading pollen. In summer, the gardens would have become a refuge from the brutal Mesopotamian heat. While the city baked under the relentless sun, the terraces offered shade and moisture, a coolness that seemed miraculous in that climate. The fountains would have been especially welcome, their spray catching the light, their sound suggesting mountain streams and distant waterfalls. The summer was the season of fruit. Figs would have ripened on the branches, their sweet flesh splitting with readiness. Pomegranates would have hung heavy, their hard shells hiding the ruby seeds within. Dates would have clustered on the palms, turning from green to amber to deep brown. The gardeners would have harvested carefully, filling baskets with the produce of the terraces, carrying it to the palace kitchens where it would become part of the royal feasts. Autumn in Babylon was subtle, the relentless heat finally breaking, the air becoming merely warm instead of punishing. In the gardens, the deciduous trees would have begun their change, their leaves turning gold and russet and bronze. The flower beds would have shifted to autumn bloomers, chrysanthemums and asters, late blooming roses, herbs gone to seed. The olives would have been ready for harvest, if olives grew in the gardens, and perhaps they did. The grapes would have hung full and ripe on their vines, ready for the wine press. The last of the summer's bounty would have been gathered and stored, preserved for the months to come. And winter, Babylonian winter, mild by northern standards but still the coolest season, would have brought its own beauty. The evergreen trees, the cedars and cypresses, the pines and firs would have stood out against the bare branches of their deciduous neighbors. The sky would have been grey more often than blue, and occasional rains would have fallen, supplementing the endless work of the water carriers. The gardens would have been quieter in winter. Fewer visitors would have climbed the terraces. The birds would have been fewer, the insects absent. The flowers would have retreated to the hardiest species, winter jasmine, perhaps, and the earliest bulbs beginning to push through the soil. But even in winter, the gardens would have been green. The grass would have stayed emerald, fed by the constant irrigation. The evergreens would have kept their needles. The fountains would have continued their play, though perhaps less vigorously than in summer. The gardens defied the seasons as they defied everything else. They were always green, always growing, always alive. That was the miracle, that in a land of scorching summers and dusty winters, a place existed where spring was eternal. What was it like, we might wonder, to be a metis in this garden? We know nothing certain about her life. No Babylonian record mentions her by name. She exists only in the Greek legends, a figure of romance more than history. But we can imagine. She would have been in her 30s or 40s when the garden reached its full glory, a mature woman, long past the homesick girl who had first entered Babylon as a bride. She had borne children, managed a household, navigated the complex politics of a royal court. She had watched her husband leave for war, year after year, and welcomed him home with victories and spoils. She had seen empires fall and cities burn. And now she had this. We might imagine her walking the terraces in the early morning, before the heat of the day, before the courtiers and petitioners descended. She would have risen before dawn, as she always did. The habits of her mountain homeland, where the cool of morning was the best time for any activity. She would have dressed simply. The elaborate robes and jewelry of state would be for later, for public appearances. Here, in her garden, she was simply a metis, a woman walking among the trees. The dew would still be on the grass. Her feet would leave dark prints on the silvery surface as she walked. The flowers would be opening their petals to the rising sun, first the roses, then the lilies, then the 1,000 smaller blooms that filled the beds. The birds would be singing, their morning chorus filling the air. She would climb slowly, pausing on each terrace to admire a particular tree, to smell a particular flower, to watch a particular bird. She knew every plant in this garden. She had helped choose them, had watched them planted, had tended them through seasons of growth. On the rock garden terrace, she might pause to sit beside the stream, listening to its music. It sounded almost like the streams of her childhood, the mountain brooks that tumbled over stones in the highlands of Media. Almost, but not quite. The stones here were wrong, brought from distant quarries rather than worn smooth by centuries of water. The plants were similar, but not the same species that grew on the slopes of the Zagros. Did the garden ease her homesickness? We cannot know. The garden, for all its magnificence, was not Media. The cedars were not the forests of her childhood. The water came from the Euphrates, pumped by slaves and machinery, not from mountain springs. The mountains themselves, real mountains, with snow on their peaks and wind in their passes, remained far away, visible only in memory. But perhaps the garden offered something else, not a replacement for what she had lost, but an acknowledgement of it. Testament to her husband's love, a daily reminder that her longing had been seen, understood, honored. Every morning, stepping into the garden, she would know that she was not forgotten, that her happiness mattered, that the most powerful king in the world had bent his will and his kingdom's resources to easing her sorrow. The thousands of workers who maintained the gardens, the gardeners and water carriers, the engineers and slaves, all labored for her comfort, for her joy. Perhaps that was worth more than any mountain. As the years passed, the garden would have become more than a reminder of her homeland. It would have become her homeland, the place where she felt most at peace, most herself. The trees she had watched grow from saplings would become old friends. The paths she had walked 1,000 times would be worn into her feet, into her memory. She would have watched her children play among the flowers. She would have strolled with her husband in the cool of evening, discussing matters of state, planning the future of the empire. She would have received visitors on the highest terrace, showing them the wonder that love had built. And when her time came, as it comes for all of us, she would have known that the garden would endure. Long after she was gone, the trees would still grow, the water would still flow, the flowers would still bloom. The love that had created this place would outlast the lovers themselves. The Greek writers tell us nothing of Amytas's death. We do not know when she died, or where she was buried, or how she was mourned. She disappears from the legend as quietly as she entered it, a romantic figure, a reason for wonders, but never a fully realized person. What we have is the garden. Her garden. The garden that rose from the plain because a king loved his queen and wanted her to smile. Nothing lasts forever. Not even wonders. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 before the Common Era, after a reign of 43 years. He had transformed Babylon into the greatest city the world had ever seen. He had conquered an empire that stretched from Egypt to the borders of Persia. He had built monuments that would stand for centuries, walls and gates, temples and palaces, and perhaps the hanging gardens themselves. But he could not control what would happen after his death. The years following Nebuchadnezzar's reign were chaotic. His son Amel-Marduk, the evil Merodach of the Hebrew scriptures, ruled for only 2 years before being assassinated by his brother-in-law Neriglissar. Neriglissar lasted 4 years before dying and leaving the throne to his young son Laboshi-Marduk, who was murdered after just 2 months by conspirators who placed the scholar Nabonidus on the throne. Nabonidus was an odd choice for king. He was not of the royal family. His interests were antiquarian rather than political. He loved excavating ancient temples and deciphering old inscriptions. He devoted himself to the worship of the moon god Sin rather than Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, alienating the powerful priesthood. Most strangely, Nabonidus spent years away from Babylon, living in the oasis of Tamar in the Arabian desert, while his son Belshazzar ruled as regent in the capital. The reasons for this self-imposed exile remain unclear. Religious devotion, perhaps, or political calculation, or simple eccentricity. While Babylon's kings quarreled and priests plotted, a new power was rising in the east. The Persians. The Persians were originally a minor tribe in the mountains of southwestern Iran, vassals of the Medes. But around 550 before the Common Era, a Persian prince named Cyrus rebelled against his Median overlord, who happened to be his grandfather, and, in a series of rapid campaigns, created the largest empire the world had ever seen. Cyrus conquered Media first, absorbing its territories and armies. Then he turned west, crushing the kingdom of Lydia and capturing its fabulously wealthy king Croesus. He took the Greek cities of the Ionian coast. He expanded east toward India, and in 539, with most of the known world already under his control, he turned his attention to Babylon. The fall of Babylon to the Persians is one of the strangest events in ancient history. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, the Persians diverted the Euphrates upstream of the city, lowering the water level enough for soldiers to wade beneath the walls along the riverbed. The Babylonians, distracted by a festival, did not notice the intrusion until it was too late. By the time the alarm was raised, Persian soldiers were already in the streets. According to the Babylonian records, there was no battle at all. Cyrus entered the city peacefully, welcomed by a population that had grown weary of Nabonidus and his neglect. The great gates opened without a fight. The empire changed hands with barely a sword drawn. The book of Daniel, in the Hebrew scriptures, tells yet another version. On the night Babylon fell, King Belshazzar was holding a feast, drinking wine from the golden vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the Temple of Solomon. A mysterious hand appeared, writing words on the wall, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Daniel interpreted the writing. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, the story says, Belshazzar was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. However it happened, whether by stealth or surrender or divine intervention, the result was the same. Babylon, the greatest city in the world, became a provincial capital of the Persian Empire. Cyrus treated Babylon well. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, chosen by Marduk himself to punish the impious Nabonidus and restore proper worship. He maintained the temples, respected local customs, allowed the city to retain much of its ancient dignity. He even issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, an act recorded both in the Hebrew scriptures and on the famous Cyrus cylinder, now in the British Museum. But Babylon was no longer the center of the world. The great building projects ceased. The walls began to crumble. The canals that watered the surrounding fields began to silt up, and the gardens, if they still existed, began their slow decline. 2 centuries after Cyrus, another conqueror came to Babylon. Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the Great, was the most remarkable military genius in human history. In little more than a decade, He conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to India, from Egypt to Central Asia. He never lost a battle. He was, at the height of his power, the undisputed master of the known world. In 331 before the Common Era, fresh from his decisive victory over the Persian king Darius at Gaugamela, Alexander approached Babylon. The city that had once resisted the greatest empires in the world opened its gates without resistance. The Babylonians, like so many others, preferred submission to destruction. Alexander entered Babylon in triumph, riding his horse Bucephalus through the Ishtar Gate, past the walls of glazed lions, along the processional way to the palace complex. The people lined the streets, throwing flowers and burning incense. The priests welcomed him as a liberator, another Cyrus, sent by the gods to free them from Persian oppression. Alexander was enchanted by Babylon. After years of campaigning in harsh climates, the mountains of Anatolia, the deserts of Egypt, the rugged terrain of Persia, the luxury of the ancient capital must have seemed like paradise. He rested his army in the city for over a month, enjoying the palaces, the temples, the famous entertainments of the Babylonian court. Alexander made Babylon his capital. He planned great things for the city, the restoration of the Etemenenki, which had fallen into disrepair, the construction of a new harbor, the improvement of the canal system, the establishment of a great trading center connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. But did Alexander see the hanging gardens? We cannot be certain. The Greek historians who accompanied Alexander say nothing about the gardens. This silence is puzzling. Surely, if one of the 7 wonders of the world stood in Babylon, Alexander's historians would have mentioned it. They described the walls and gates, the palaces and temples, the ziggurat, and the processional way. But of the hanging gardens, nothing. Several explanations are possible. Perhaps the gardens had already fallen into ruin by Alexander's time. 2 centuries of Persian rule, with the capital moved to Persepolis and Susa, might have meant neglect for Babylon's wonders. The complex irrigation systems that kept the gardens alive might have broken down. The trees might have died. The terraces crumbled. By 331, the hanging gardens might have been nothing but a memory, a story told by old men who remembered their parents' stories. Perhaps the gardens still existed, but Alexander's historians simply failed to record them. Ancient writers were selective in what they reported. They were primarily interested in military matters, battles and sieges, strategies and tactics. A garden, however remarkable, might not have seemed worth mentioning, or perhaps, and this is the possibility that troubles scholars most, the gardens were never in Babylon at all. But we shall come to that possibility in time. What we know is that Alexander loved Babylon. He returned to the city again and again during his campaigns, making it the effective capital of his empire. He planned to rebuild its greatest monuments. He began preparations for new expeditions to Arabia, to the Western Mediterranean, perhaps even to India once more. But Alexander's plans, like Nebuchadnezzar's before him, outlived their creator. In 323, before the Common Era, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. The cause is unknown, perhaps typhoid fever, perhaps malaria, perhaps poison, perhaps the accumulated effect of years of wounds and hard drinking. He lingered for 10 days, growing weaker, losing the ability to speak. His generals gathered around his bed, begging to know who would inherit his empire. The sources say that Alexander whispered only 3 words, to the strongest, who was 32 years old. With Alexander's death, his empire shattered into warring fragments. His generals, the Diadochi, or successors, carved out kingdoms for themselves. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took Babylon and the eastern provinces. Antigonus claimed Macedon and Greece. For the next 40 years, They fought among themselves, dividing and redividing Alexander's legacy. Babylon passed to the Seleucids. For a time, it remained an important city, a center of trade, a seat of Greek learning, a connection between East and West. But the Seleucids preferred to build new cities in their own image. They founded Seleucia on the Tigris, just 40 miles away, and gradually shifted the population and the commerce to their new capital. Babylon, the city that had dominated the world for thousands of years, began its final decline. By the time of Christ, Babylon was a ghost town. The Roman geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, described what remained. The greater part of Babylon is so deserted, he wrote, that one would not hesitate to say that the great city is a great desert. The walls still stood, more or less, their mud brick gradually dissolving in the winter rains, their glory fading year by year. The temples were ruins, their priests scattered, their rituals forgotten. The palaces had crumbled, their courtyards filled with rubble and sand. The canals that had once irrigated the surrounding fields were choked with silt. The population had dwindled to a few thousand souls, living among the monuments of a vanished age. They farmed the fields between the ruins. They grazed their sheep on the mounds that had once been temples. They used the ancient bricks for building material, scattering the inscriptions that recorded the deeds of kings. And the hanging gardens, if they had ever existed, were gone. Not even ruins remained. No collapsed terraces, no fallen columns, no hint of where they might have stood. They had vanished as completely as if they had never been. But the legend endured. Greek and Roman writers continued to include the hanging gardens in their lists of the world's wonders. They copied each other's descriptions, adding embellishments, inventing details. The gardens grew more magnificent with each telling, larger, greener, more impossible. Antipater of Sidon, writing in the 2nd century, before the Common Era, composed a famous poem listing the 7 wonders. I have gazed on the walls of impregnable Babylon along which chariots may race, he wrote, and on the Zeus by the banks of the Alpheus. I have seen the hanging gardens, and the colossus of the Helios, the great man-made mountains of the lofty pyramids, and the gigantic tomb of Mausolus. The gardens appear in the works of writers who never saw them, who were repeating stories passed down through generations. By the Middle Ages, when Babylon had been reduced to shapeless mounds in the Iraqi desert, the hanging gardens had achieved an almost mythical status. Medieval artists depicted them as fantastic structures, towers and spires wreathed in impossible vegetation, more like the illustrations in fairy tales than anything an engineer could build. They became a symbol of lost splendor, of the vanity of earthly kingdoms, of the inevitable decay of all human works. And they became a mystery. Where were they? What did they look like? Did they even exist? For centuries, the questions went unanswered. Babylon was too remote, too ruined, too forgotten to attract scholarly attention. The site was visited occasionally by travelers who reported mounds of earth and scattered bricks, but systematic investigation was impossible in the politically unstable region. That changed in the 19th century, with the expansion of European power into the Middle East and the rise of archaeology as a scientific discipline. Scholars began to take interest in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. Excavations at Nineveh, at Ur, at Babylon itself, revealed treasures that filled the museums of London and Berlin and Paris. The ancient Near East, so long a blank space on the map of history, began to come into focus, and the search for the hanging gardens began in earnest. Robert Koldewey was a German archaeologist with a passion for Babylon. He arrived at the site in 1899 and stayed for 18 years, excavating systematically through World War and political upheaval. He uncovered the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, the foundations of the great temples. He traced the walls that Herodotus had described, the palaces that Nebuchadnezzar had built, and he searched for the Hanging Gardens. Koldewey examined every corner of the palace complex, looking for evidence of the terrace structures described by the ancient writers. He was looking for several things: a stone foundation, unlike the mud brick of ordinary Babylonian buildings; vaulted chambers that could have supported the weight of earth and trees; evidence of water-lifting machinery. In the northeast corner of the southern palace, he found something promising: a series of 14 vaulted chambers, arranged in 2 rows, with massive walls of baked brick. The chambers were unlike anything else in the palace. Their construction was heavier, their materials more durable. They seemed designed to bear a great weight. In one of the chambers, Koldewey found a well with an unusual design, 3 shafts side by side, as if intended for some kind of water-lifting mechanism. The arrangement suggested a chain pump or similar device, capable of raising water to a considerable height. Koldewey was convinced he had found the substructure of the Hanging Gardens. But later scholars were not so sure. The chambers were too small, they argued. Even combined, they covered an area of perhaps 60 by 40 feet, far smaller than the 400 feet on each side described by Diodorus. The well showed no signs of having actually been used for irrigation, no mineral deposits, no wear patterns, no evidence of the constant use that watering a garden would require. And similar vaulted chambers had been found elsewhere in Mesopotamia, used simply for storage. The heavy construction was to protect valuable goods, grain and oil, perhaps, or military supplies, from moisture and temperature fluctuations. There was nothing inherently gardening-related about them. Some scholars proposed alternative locations. Perhaps the gardens had stood along the walls of the city, which were famously thick and could have supported terraces on their tops. Perhaps they were on the summer palace, far to the north, where the breezes were cooler and a garden would have been more practical. Perhaps they were somewhere else entirely, in a location not yet excavated, or destroyed beyond recognition. Others began to wonder whether the gardens had existed at all. The silence of the Babylonian records was troubling. Nebuchadnezzar left detailed inscriptions describing his building projects, the walls, the gates, the temples, the palaces. He even mentions palace gardens in one inscription, describing a high garden for the amazement of the people. But this brief mention is nothing like the elaborate descriptions in the Greek sources. If Nebuchadnezzar had built a wonder of the world, surely he would have boasted of it more fully. Surely other Babylonian texts would mention it: temple records, administrative documents, the letters and poems that have survived by the thousands. The mystery deepened. And then, in 1994, an Oxford scholar named Stephanie Daly proposed a radical new theory. What if the Hanging Gardens were real, but in the wrong city? Stephanie Daly had spent years studying the ancient texts of Mesopotamia, the cuneiform inscriptions on clay tablets and building stones, the records of kings and priests and administrators. She knew the evidence, or rather the lack of it, for the Hanging Gardens at Babylon, and she had noticed something curious in the Assyrian records. The Assyrian king Sennacherib, the same king who had destroyed Babylon in 689 before the Common Era, left extensive records of his own building projects. And among those projects was a garden. Not just any garden, a garden with terraces rising like a mountain above the plain, a garden watered by aqueducts that brought water from the mountains, lifted by screws and engines to the highest levels. A garden that Sennacherib himself called a wonder for all peoples. This garden was at Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, more than 200 miles north of Babylon. Daly's argument was meticulous and controversial. She gathered evidence from multiple sources: inscriptions, archaeological remains, artistic depictions, to make her case. First, there was the matter of contemporary records. In Babylon, No text from Nebuchadnezzar's time mentions anything like the Hanging Gardens as described by the Greeks. The king's inscriptions are detailed and boastful, listing every temple rebuilt, every wall strengthened, every gate beautified. If he had built a wonder of the world, surely he would have said so. In Nineveh, by contrast, Sennacherib left explicit records of an elaborate palace garden. His inscriptions describe a garden of all kinds of fruit trees, forest trees and trees of the mountains, planted on terraces. He describes bronze screws used to raise water, technology that would not appear elsewhere for centuries. He built aqueducts stretching for miles, bringing water from the mountains to his capital. The archaeological evidence supported the Assyrian connection. At Nineveh, excavators had found traces of Sennacherib's irrigation works, canals and aqueducts with inscriptions recording their construction. They had found the foundations of palace gardens, with elaborate water channels. They had found nothing comparable at Babylon. Perhaps most striking was a carved relief from the palace of Sennacherib's grandson Ashurbanipal, now in the British Museum. The relief depicts a lush garden with trees growing on terraces, supported by rows of columns. In the background, an aqueduct carries water toward the garden. The image matches the Greek descriptions of the Hanging Gardens more closely than anything ever found at Babylon. But how, if the gardens were at Nineveh, did they come to be associated with Babylon? Daly had an answer. It lay in the curious history of the name Babylon itself. When Sennacherib destroyed Babylon in 689, he did more than tear down its buildings. He sought to erase the city's very identity. He carried off the sacred statue of Marduk. He scattered the priests. He tried to end Babylon's role as a sacred city, a competitor to Assyrian religious prestige. And then, having destroyed Old Babylon, he gave its name to his own capital. Nineveh, Sennacherib declared, would henceforth be known as New Babylon. The name persisted for decades. During this period, any visitor to New Babylon, that is, Nineveh, might have seen the magnificent gardens that Sennacherib had built. They might have heard the city called Babylon. They might have reported what they saw using that name. Centuries later, when Greek writers compiled their lists of wonders, they worked from fragmentary sources, travelers' tales, temple records, half-remembered stories. They knew of magnificent gardens somewhere in Mesopotamia. They knew the name Babylon. The confusion between Old Babylon and New Babylon had been lost to time. And so the gardens of Nineveh became the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The theory was elegant and well supported. But it was not universally accepted. Critics pointed out that the Greek sources explicitly associate the gardens with Nebuchadnezzar, not with any Assyrian king. Berosus, the Babylonian priest who wrote the earliest account, would surely have known the difference between his own city and Nineveh. The love story of Nebuchadnezzar and Amytis, however romantic, might preserve genuine tradition. The debate continues to this day. Perhaps it will never be resolved. Let us return, one last time, to the plain where Babylon once stood. Today, the ruins lie about 50 miles south of Baghdad, in modern Iraq. The site is called Hilla in Arabic, after the modern town that has grown up nearby. Farmers work the fields between the ancient mounds. Children play among the remnants of walls that once guarded the greatest city on earth. The site has suffered in recent decades. Wars have swept across Iraq, the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Gulf War of 1991, the American invasion of 2003, and the long chaos that followed. Soldiers have dug trenches through the archaeological layers. Military vehicles have cracked the glazed bricks of the ancient walls. Looters have carried off artifacts that survived 26 centuries only to be sold on the black market. And then there was the palace. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein ordered the construction of a new palace on top of one of the mounds of ancient Babylon. He saw himself as a modern Nebuchadnezzar, a great Iraqi leader restoring the glory of his nation. He stamped bricks with his name, just as Nebuchadnezzar had done millennia before. This was built by Saddam Hussein, son of Nebuchadnezzar, to glorify Iraq. The palace was never completed. It stands today as a hollow shell, its walls decorated with murals of Saddam in ancient costume, overlooking the ruins of the city he claimed to emulate. Archaeologists fear that its construction damaged irretrievable layers of history buried beneath. Yet despite all this, something of Babylon survives. The Ishtar Gate stands reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, its blue-glazed bricks gleaming as they must have gleamed in Nebuchadnezzar's day. Lions and dragons and bulls march across its surface in eternal procession, guardians of a city that no longer exists. The lions of the processional way prowl through the corridors of museums from London to Baghdad. Cuneiform tablets, recovered by generations of archaeologists, fill archives and study rooms, waiting for scholars to unlock their secrets. The clay cylinders that bear Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions can still be read, still boast of the king's achievements, still invoke the blessings of gods whose names have been forgotten, and the legend of the Hanging Gardens endures, perhaps the most durable wonder of all, outlasting even the stones. We may never know the truth. The gardens may have stood in Babylon, destroyed by time and neglect, their ruins lying beneath the modern water table or the foundations of Saddam's palace, forever beyond the reach of archaeology. They may have stood in Nineveh, as Daly suggests, their glory attributed to the wrong city through centuries of confusion. They may never have existed at all, a pure legend, a dream of paradise that captured the imagination of the ancient world and has held it ever since. Perhaps it does not matter. What matters is the idea of them, the dream of a garden that floats in the sky, that brings the mountains to the desert, that defies the laws of nature through human ingenuity and love. Somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, someone looked at barren land and imagined paradise. Someone refused to accept that the impossible was truly impossible. Someone built, or dreamed of building, a wonder that would inspire humanity for millennia. That dream is real, whether or not the gardens ever were. What remains of Babylon today? The physical city has crumbled. The walls that Herodotus described have eroded to low ridges. The temples where priests once chanted have become mounds of rubble. The palaces where kings ruled have vanished beneath centuries of sand and dust. But Babylon's legacy lives on in ways we rarely recognize. The calendar we use descends from Babylon. The Babylonians divided the year into 12 months, as we do. They named the days of the week for celestial bodies, the sun and moon, Mars and Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn, names that survived, transformed, in our Sunday and Monday, in the French Mardi and Mercredi, in the Spanish Jews, and Viernes. The mathematics we use owes much to Babylon. The Babylonians counted in base 60, a system that seems odd until you realize that 60 is evenly divisible by 12 different numbers. From this system come our 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours, our 360-degree circles, our angular measurements and astronomical calculations. The astronomy we practice began in Babylon. The constellations of the zodiac, the names of the planets, the very concept of predicting celestial events, all these trace their origins to the temple observatories of ancient Mesopotamia. Every time you read a horoscope, you are touching the legacy of Babylon, and the literature we read echoes with Babylonian stories. The tale of the Great Flood, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is older than Noah. The Tower of Babel, reaching toward heaven, is almost certainly the Etem Enanke, the great ziggurat of Babylon. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Daniel and Isaiah, shaped their visions in response to Babylonian power. The word paradise itself comes to us through Babylon. The ancient Persians called an unclosed garden a paradisa, a walled place, a pleasure ground, a space set apart from the harsh world outside. The Greeks borrowed the word, and through them it came to Latin, to French, to English. When we speak of paradise, we are speaking of gardens. And gardens, the very idea of gardens, the impulse to create ordered beauty from wild nature, owes something to those ancient builders who first imagined trees growing in the sky. The hanging gardens may never have existed in stone and water, but they have existed for 25 centuries in the human imagination. They have inspired painters and poets, architects and landscape designers. They have become a symbol of what we can achieve when we refuse to accept the world as we find it. That is the true legacy of Babylon. Not walls and temples, not laws and calendars, but the audacity of dreaming impossible things, and sometimes, against all odds, making them real. How do we remember what we have never seen? None of us have walked the terraces of the hanging gardens. None of us have smelled the roses, heard the fountains, felt the grass beneath our bare feet. The gardens exist for us only in words, in the descriptions of ancient writers, in the poems and paintings they have inspired, in stories like this one. And yet, when you close your eyes and imagine the gardens, something appears. A green hillside rising against a blue sky. Water flowing through channels of stone. Trees spreading their branches over paths dappled with sunlight. Where does this image come from? Perhaps it comes from gardens you have actually visited, parks and pleasure grounds, botanical collections and private yachts. The human memory of gardens is vast and deep. We have been making gardens since the beginning of civilization, since the first farmers decided to plant beauty as well as food. Perhaps it comes from paintings and photographs, from movies and television, from the countless images of gardens that flow through our visual culture. We have seen so many gardens, in so many forms, that the image rises easily to mind. Or perhaps it comes from somewhere deeper, from some ancestral memory of green places, of the forests and savannas where a species evolved. We are creatures who evolved surrounded by plants, who learned to read the signals of leaf and flower, who found safety in the shade of trees. The garden, in this view, is a return to our origins, a creation of the world as we remember it should be, green and fruitful, abundant and safe. The hanging gardens tap into this ancient longing. They represent the ultimate garden, the garden of gardens, a paradise created in defiance of the desert. When we imagine them, we imagine our deepest desires for beauty, for abundance, for a world transformed by love. Perhaps this is why the legend has endured so long. Perhaps this is why we keep telling the story, keep imagining the terraces, keep dreaming of gardens we have never seen. The memory of the hanging gardens is not really a memory at all. It is a hope that somewhere, in some time, such beauty exists. That human beings can create such wonders. That love can build such monuments. It is a hope worth keeping. We live in a world that values proof. We want evidence. We want photographs and measurements, carbon dates and DNA analysis, excavation reports and satellite imagery. We are skeptical of legends, dismissive of stories that cannot be verified. If we cannot find the remains, we say, perhaps the thing never existed. But the hanging gardens remind us that stories have a power independent of their truth. For 25 centuries, the legend of the gardens has inspired artists and dreamers. It has been painted and sculpted, described in poetry and prose, reimagined in every medium that human creativity has devised. Medieval illuminators depicted the gardens in their manuscripts. Renaissance architects drew plans for their own hanging gardens, terraced structures that echoed the descriptions of the ancient writers. Modern landscape designers have created living monuments to the legend, green and flowering testimony to the enduring power of the idea. The gardens have inspired real gardens. The terraced gardens of Isfahan, built by Persian Shahs who knew the legend well. The water gardens of the Italian Renaissance, with their fountains and cascades and green geometry. The public parks of great cities, designed to bring the countryside into the urban heart. All of these owe something to the dream of the hanging gardens, the dream of a place where nature and human ingenuity combine to create beauty. And the gardens have inspired something else as well. They have inspired the belief that human beings can create wonders, that we are not bound by the limitations of our environment. That imagination, combined with skill and determination and love, can transform the world. The Babylonians lived in a desert. Water was scarce, greenery rare, the land flat and brown and hostile to growing things. Every logical argument said that a garden like the one described by the ancient writers was impossible, and yet someone imagined it anyway. Someone dreamed of terraces thick with trees, of water flowing uphill against all natural law, of a green mountain rising from the barren plain. Someone looked at the world as it was and saw the world as it could be. The capacity for imagination, for dreaming beyond what seems possible, is perhaps the greatest wonder of all. It is the quality that has allowed human beings to create civilizations, to build monuments, to transform the face of the earth. It is the quality that led our ancestors out of caves and into cities, that has taken us from stone tools to spacecraft, that continues to push the boundaries of the possible. The hanging gardens may have been an illusion, but the spirit that imagined them was real. And that spirit, the spirit that refuses to accept limits, that dreams of better things, that builds wonders in the face of impossibility, that spirit is still with us. It is, perhaps, the most lasting gift of ancient Babylon. Let us walk through the gardens once more, but this time in the evening. The sun is setting. The sky turns gold and crimson, colors reflected in the slow waters of the Euphrates. The heat of the day is finally breaking. A cool breeze rises from the river, carrying the first hints of night. The gardens look different now than they did this morning. The slanting light casts long shadows across the terraces, purple and deep. The trees stand in silhouette against the burning sky, their branches reaching upward like supplicating hands. The fountains catch the last rays of sun, glittering like scattered gold. You climb the stairs slowly, in no hurry now. The path is familiar. You have walked it twice today, in the cool of morning and the heat of afternoon. But the evening garden is its own world, distinct from day. On the first terrace, the roses are closing their petals, folding inward as the light fades. But other flowers are just beginning to open. The jasmine, which hung silent and scentless through the day, is releasing its fragrance now, that sweet, intoxicating perfume that fills the evening air. The moonflowers are unfurling their white petals, catching the last light. The bees have gone to their hives, but other creatures are emerging. Moths flutter among the night-blooming flowers, their wings pale in the dimness. Bats swoop overhead, feeding on the insects that rise from the grass. Somewhere in the shadows, a nightingale begins to sing. You pause on a terrace where a small pool reflects the darkening sky. The water lilies have closed, but the lotus flowers stand open still, their petals glowing pink and white against the dark water. Fish move beneath the surface, golden shadows in the depths. The lamps are being lit throughout the gardens. Servants move from post to post, touching flame to wick, leaving behind small pools of golden light. The terraces become a constellation of lights, stars brought down to earth, guiding your way through the gathering darkness. You reach the highest terrace as the first real stars appear in the sky. The moon is rising over the eastern walls, nearly full, painting the garden in silver and shadow. From here, you can see the whole city spread out below, the torches on the walls, the lamps in the windows, the fires of the temple where the priests are making their evening offerings. The air is cool now, almost chilly after the heat of the day. You wrap a light robe around your shoulders and sit on a stone bench, looking out over the garden and the city and the endless plain beyond. The nightingale is still singing. Its song rises and falls, pure and liquid, filling the darkness with beauty. Other birds join in, the soft cooing of doves settling into their roosts, the distant cry of an owl hunting in the fields beyond the walls. The water murmurs all around you. The fountains play more quietly now, their daytime exuberance giving way to a gentler music. The channels trickle through the darkness, feeding the roots of trees you can barely see. The fragrance of jasmine is almost overwhelming. It mingles with other night scents, the sweetness of flowering tobacco, the spice of night-blooming cactus, the green freshness of damp earth and growing things. You close your eyes and breathe deeply. The garden embraces you. The sounds and scents of the night wrap around you like a blanket. You are at peace. Somewhere below, in the depths of the palace, the king and queen may be looking up at these same stars, breathing this same jasmine-scented air. The great and the small, the powerful and the humble, all share the night, all share the garden, all share the ancient peace of darkness falling over Babylon. In the depths of the Babylonian night, the garden had visitors. Not human visitors. The guards at the gates saw to that. But other creatures moved through the terraces, living their own lives in this artificial paradise. The bats came first, as the last light faded from the sky. They emerged from the shadows beneath the terraces, where they roosted in the cool chambers between the columns. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, fluttering into the dusk on silent wings. They hunted the insects that rose from the grass and flowers, moths and beetles, gnats and midges. You could see them against the fading sky, swooping and diving, their echolocation guiding them to prey invisible to human eyes. Later came the owls. They nested in the cedars, in the hollows where branches had broken away. Their calls echoed through the night, soft hoots and eerie screams, the sounds of predators hunting in the darkness. The owls hunted mice and rats, the small creatures that lived in the garden's shadows, feeding on fallen fruit and scattered seeds. Without the owls, these rodents might have overrun the terraces. Nature had its own way of maintaining balance, even in a garden built by human hands. On the lower terraces, where the channels brought water from the river, frogs sang their ancient songs. They had come up the waterways, colonizing the pools and fountains, filling the night with their chorus. Their songs echoed off the stone walls, creating the illusion of a wild marsh in the heart of the city. And in the trees, other creatures stirred. Small birds, restless in sleep, shifted on their branches. Insects moved among the leaves, their tiny legs carrying them on journeys measured in inches. Spiders spun their webs between stems and branches, trapping the unwary, playing their part in the garden's ecology. The garden was not a static thing, not a painting or a sculpture frozen in time. It was a living system, constantly changing, constantly in motion. Even at night, when the humans slept, life continued, feeding and hunting, growing and dying, the endless cycles of the natural world. The Babylonians understood this. They believed that the gods had created a world in which all things had their place, in which predator and prey, plant and animal, human and nature were woven together in a great tapestry of existence. The garden was their attempt to create a small piece of that tapestry, a place where the order of nature and the order of civilization came together, where beauty and function intertwined, where the wild and the cultivated existed side by side. In the garden at night, that vision was realized. The bats and owls, the frogs and insects, knew nothing of Nebuchadnezzar or Ametis. They knew only that this was a good place, wet and green, full of food and shelter, a paradise for creatures who had no concept of paradise. Perhaps that is the truest measure of the garden's success. Let us return to the gardens one more time. You are a gardener now, not a visitor, not a courtier, but one of those who tends this place, who knows every plant by name, who has watched these trees grow from saplings. You rise before dawn, as you always do. The stars are still bright overhead, the morning star hanging in the east like a lamp. The air is cool as it ever gets in Babylon, and you wrap your work robe around you as you make your way to the garden. You enter through a small door, not the grand entrance used by visitors. This door is for those who work here, who know the garden's secrets, who maintain its beauty while others merely admire it. The garden is different at this hour. The visitors have not yet arrived. The paths are empty. The only sounds are the splash of water and the first stirrings of the birds. You walk the lower terrace, checking the channels that carry water to the plants. Here, a small blockage has formed, leaves and debris swept down from above. You clear it with practiced hands, and the water flows freely again. On the second terrace, the roses are just beginning to open. They unfurl as the sky lightens, their petals touched with dew, their fragrance rising on the morning air. You inspect each bush, looking for signs of disease or pest, removing the spent blooms to encourage new ones. You know these roses. You have tended them for years. You pruned them in winter, fertilized them in spring, watered them through the scorching summer. Some you planted yourself, carrying cuttings from other gardens, from the royal estates in the countryside, from traders who brought rare varieties from distant lands. On the third terrace, the fruit trees demand your attention. The figs are ripening. You can tell by the slight softening, the darkening of color, the way the fruit bends on its stem. You pick a few that are ready, placing them carefully in your basket. The king's table will have fresh figs today, thanks to your labor. You move higher, terrace by terrace, checking and tending, watering and pruning. The sun rises. The air warms. Other gardeners arrive, nodding to you as they take up their own tasks. By mid-morning, the visitors begin to appear. Courtiers stroll the paths, admiring the flowers, commenting on the improvements since their last visit. You step aside to let them pass, invisible in your work clothes, a servant among the beauty they have come to enjoy. They do not see you. They do not think about the labor that maintains this paradise. And that is as it should be. A garden should seem effortless, magical, a gift from nature rather than a triumph of human effort. But you know the truth. You know every block, channel, and broken branch, every pest and disease, every failure and success. You know how close this garden comes to death every year, how much work is required to keep it alive. And you are proud. This is your work, your life, your art. The visitors may forget the garden when they leave. You never will. The garden is part of you now, and you are part of the garden. Let us return, one last time, to the gardens of legend. The sun is setting over Babylon. The sky blazes gold and crimson, colors reflected in the slow waters of the Euphrates. The heat of the day is finally breaking. A cool breeze rises from the river, carrying the scent of water and growing things. The gardens rise before you, a green mountain in the fading light. Shadows pool among the terraces, purple and deep, growing longer as the sun descends. The fountains catch the last rays of light, glittering like scattered gold. The trees stand in silhouette against the burning sky, their branches reaching upward like hands lifted in prayer. The birds are settling into the branches for the night. Their songs grow quieter, more sporadic, a final trill, a last call, then silence. The bees have returned to their hives. The butterflies have folded their wings. You have spent the day wandering these terraces. You have climbed to the highest level and looked out over the city. You have rested in the shade of cedars and pomegranates. You have trailed your fingers through cool fountains. You have breathed the perfume of 1,000 flowers. Now you sit on a stone bench on one of the lower terraces, watching the light fade. The water murmurs around you, an endless sound, like breathing. Somewhere in the depths of the gardens, the machinery continues its work, lifting water from the river, carrying it through hidden channels to the roots of every tree. The gardens drink deeply of the Euphrates, drawing life from the desert. The first stars are appearing, one by one, pricking through the darkening sky. You recognize them, the same stars that shine over Media, over every land in the empire. The same stars that humans have watched since the beginning of time, naming them, making stories about them, finding patterns in their eternal dance. Somewhere above you, in a pavilion on the highest terrace, a light appears, a lamp, perhaps, in the Queen's chambers. You imagine Ametis there, looking out at the sunset as she has looked out at 1,000 sunsets. She is no longer young. Her hair is grey now, her face lined with years. But the mountains of her homeland still rise in her memory, and the garden her husband built her still blooms around her. She is content, you think. Or if not content, then at peace. She has made a home in this strange flat land, surrounded by a garden that is half memory and half creation. She has watched her children grow, her grandchildren born. She has lived a long life in a time when lives were often short. And she has been loved. That much is certain. However the legend grew, however much was invented by later poets, this much is true. Someone loved her enough to build impossible things. Someone looked at the desert and saw mountains. The sky deepens from crimson to purple to blue. The last light fades from the western horizon. The stars grow brighter, scattered across the heavens like seeds across a dark field. You close your eyes. The scent of jasmine surrounds you, that night-blooming flower whose fragrance fills the garden after dark. The sound of water fills your ears. The cool of evening settles on your skin. The gardens embrace you, green and living, real or imagined, a dream made solid, if only for a moment. The night deepens over Babylon. The city grows quiet. The markets have closed, their stalls shuttered, their merchants gone home to their families. The temples have dimmed their lamps, their priests retired after the evening offerings. The palace gates are barred. Only the guards remain awake on the great walls, watching the darkness beyond. In the gardens, the water continues its endless journey. Up from the river, through bronze screws and chain pumps, through channels cut in stone, conduits laid beneath the earth, across the terraces, distributed through 1,000 hidden pathways, down through the roots of trees, the stems of flowers, the blades of grass, back to the river again. An endless cycle, like breathing, like the tide, like the slow turning of seasons that brings spring after winter, life after death. You do not need to remember any of this. The names and dates, the theories and debates, let them fade like the last light of sunset. Let them drift away like clouds across the Mesopotamian sky. What remains is simpler. A garden. A gift. A love that built mountains in the desert. The moon is rising now, fat and golden, over the eastern horizon. It touches the highest terrace of the garden with silver light. It finds the surface of the pools and turns them to mirrors. It spills down through the branches of the cedars, dappling the ground with shadow and light. The same moon that rose over Babylon 3,000 years ago The same moon that will rise 3,000 years from now over whatever remains of human works and dreams. Let it rise. Let it light the gardens for a little while longer. Rest now. The day is done. The wonders have been seen. Let the gardens grow in your dreams. Let the water carry you down. Down through the terraces. Down through the leaves and flowers. Down into the cool earth, where seeds sleep until spring. The gardens are waiting. They have always been waiting. Whether in Babylon or Nineveh, whether in stone or story, whether real or dreamed, they are waiting for you. Sleep now. Let the gardens hold you. Green and quiet, cool and dark. The water is singing. Can you hear it? Flowing down through the terraces, trickling through hidden channels, whispering secrets of ancient kings and mountain princesses. Listen, the water carries you, lifting you, holding you, carrying you down, down, and down, and down. The gardens embrace you, forever green, forever flowering, forever waiting. Sleep. Sleep. Extended sleep section. The night deepens over Babylon. The city grows quiet. The markets have closed, their stalls shuttered, their merchants gone home. The temples have dimmed their lamps, their priests retired to their chambers. The palace gates are barred for the night. Only the guards remain awake on the great walls, their torches flickering against the darkness. In the gardens, the water continues its endless journey. Listen to it. Up from the river, through bronze screws and chain pumps. The workers are still at their wheels, walking their endless rounds, lifting water against the pull of gravity. Splash and creak, splash and creak. The rhythm of the waterworks, steady as a heartbeat. Through channels cut in stone, the water flows through hidden conduits, through pipes of clay and passages of brick, finding its way to every corner of the garden. It does not know where it goes. It simply flows. Across the terraces, the water emerges from fountains and spills down cascades, pools in basins and trickles through beds of flowers. It touches the roots of trees, soaks into the deep earth, feeds the life that grows in this impossible place. Down through the roots of trees, the stems of flowers, the blades of grass. The plants drink deeply, drawing the water up through their tissues, releasing it as vapor from their leaves. The air of the garden is moist with this breathing, with this silent exhalation of 10,000 plants. Back to the river again. What the garden does not keep, it returns. The water trickles down through the terraces, finds its way to drains and channels, flows back to the Euphrates from which it came. An endless cycle. Like breathing. Like the tide. Like the slow turning of seasons that brings spring after winter, growth after dormancy, light after darkness. You do not need to remember any of this. The names and dates, Nebuchadnezzar, Amytis, Sennacherib, Cyrus, let them fade. They are just names. They are just sounds. The theories and debates, Babylon or Nineveh, real or imagined, built or dreamed, let them drift away. They matter to scholars. They do not matter now. What matters is simpler. What matters is the garden. The green and growing garden. The cool and quiet garden. The garden that is waiting for you. The moon is high now, flooding the terraces with silver light. The shadows are black and sharp-edged. The illuminated spaces bright as day. The garden is a world of contrasts, light and dark, silver and black, real and dreamlike. The nightingale has stopped singing. The other birds are silent. Even the insects have stilled. Only the water speaks, and it speaks softly, a murmur and a whisper, a lullaby sung by fountains. The air smells of jasmine. Let the scent fill you. Let it enter with each breath, sweet and heavy and infinitely comforting. Jasmine has been the scent of gardens since gardens were first planted. It is the scent of peace. The air smells of roses. Roses that have bloomed and will bloom again. Roses that grew in Babylon and Media, in Persia and Egypt, in every land where humans have made gardens. The rose is the queen of flowers. Let her majesty surround you. The air smells of water, clean water, moving water, living water. The smell of the river that gives life to the desert. The smell of fountains and pools, of hidden streams and cascading falls. The smell of abundance in a thirsty land. Let these scents carry you. Let them carry you down. Down through the terraces, level by level. Down past the flower beds and the fountains. Down past the fruit trees and the rose gardens. Down past the cedars and the cypresses. Down into the shadows beneath the lowest terrace. Down where the moss grows thick on ancient stones. Down where the water trickles toward the river. Down, and down, and down. The garden is everywhere now. It is above you and below you, around you and within you. The boundaries have dissolved. You are not in the garden, you are part of the garden. You are a leaf, drinking light. You are a root, drinking water. You are a flower, opening to the moon. The water that flows through the garden flows through you. The breath of the trees is your breath. The dreams of the garden are your dreams. Rest now. The garden will hold you. The water will carry you. The flowers will guard your sleep. You are safe here. You have always been safe here. The garden has been waiting for you. For thousands of years, the garden has been waiting. And now you have come home. Sleep. Let the garden hold you. Green and quiet. Cool and dark. The water is singing. Can you hear it? Singing of rivers that flow to the sea. Singing of rain that falls on distant mountains. Singing of springs that rise from deep earth. Singing of gardens that grow in the desert. Singing of love that builds impossible things. Let the song carry you. Let it carry you deep, deep into sleep, deep into dreams, deep into the green heart of the garden. Sleep, sleep, sleep. The garden embraces you, forever green, forever flowering, forever waiting. Sleep now. The night is almost over now. In the east, the sky is beginning to lighten, not yet dawn, but the first hint of dawn, the promise of the sun still hidden below the horizon. The stars are fading, one by one, their ancient light giving way to the coming day. In the garden, the night creatures are returning to their hiding places. The bats spiral back to their roosts beneath the terraces. The owls settle into their hollows, preparing for a day of sleep. The frogs fall silent, one after another, until only the most persistent singer remains. The garden is at its quietest now, in these last hours before dawn. The water still flows, of course. It always flows. But even the water seems gentler, softer, as if the garden itself is sleeping. And you are sleeping too. You have been sleeping for a long time now, dreaming of gardens, dreaming of Babylon, dreaming of wonders that may or may not have existed. The dream has carried you through the night, through the hours of darkness, through the turning of the stars. Soon you will wake. The sun will rise. The world will call you back to its demands, its schedules, its endless lists of things to do. But not yet. For now, there is only the garden, only the dream, only the deep peace of the last hours of night. Let the dream continue a little longer. Let the garden hold you a little tighter. Let the water sing its quiet song. There is no hurry. There is no urgency. There is only rest, only peace. Only the green heart of the garden, beating slowly, steadily, in rhythm with your own. The sky grows lighter. The first birds are beginning to stir. Somewhere in the city, a rooster crows, announcing the coming day. But in the garden, there is no hurry. The garden exists outside of time. The garden was here before you dreamed it. The garden will be here long after you wake. You can always return, whenever you need rest, whenever you need peace, whenever you need to remember that beauty exists in the world. The garden will be waiting. It is always waiting. For you. Sleep now, for these last sweet hours. Let the dream carry you gently toward morning. Let the garden fade slowly, softly, as the day approaches. Let the memory of green terraces and flowing water stay with you, even as you wake. Sleep, rest, peace. The garden is always waiting, always green, always beautiful, always yours. Estimated duration: 4.5 hours at 100 words per minute. Shorts hooks for YouTube Shorts. Short 1. The only wonder that may not exist. Of all the 7 wonders of the ancient world, only one has never been found. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon may be the greatest mystery, or the greatest hoax in human history. Short 2. A king who built mountains for love. When a Persian princess arrived in Babylon, she was homesick for the green mountains of her homeland. So the most powerful king in the world did something impossible. He built her a mountain. Short 3. What if they were in the wrong city? For 2,000 years, we've searched for the Hanging Gardens in Babylon. We've never found them. But what if they were never there at all? What if we've been looking in the wrong city the entire time?